Friendship Paradox. Have you ever felt like your friends are more popular than you? That they seem to have more connections, more followers, more vibrant lives? You're not imagining it. This feeling is backed by a real, mathematically grounded phenomenon called the Friendship Paradox. It's not a trick of the mind, it's a consequence of how social networks work. Picture a web of people connected by lines of friendship. Some are highly connected, others less so. When you randomly pick a person and ask about their friends, those friends are likely to be the more connected individuals, simply because they appear in more networks. The result is a bias. On average, your friends will seem more popular than you. Sociologist Scott Feld formalized this in 1991. He showed that people with many connections are overrepresented in everyone else's social circles. It's not about self-worth or personality, it's structural. Yet, emotionally, it doesn't always feel that way. In the age of social media, the paradox intensifies. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok don't just connect people, they amplify certain voices, and those with the most followers tend to post more, appear more, and dominate your feed. You're not seeing a representative slice of your network, you're seeing the most visible slice. That warped lens makes others seem more popular, successful, or fulfilled, creating a feedback loop of comparison and self-doubt. Psychological studies show that this constant comparison can lead to anxiety, inadequacy, and depression. You might feel like you're falling behind, but it's the structure of the network, not your actual place in it, that creates this illusion. But this paradox isn't all bad. Public health researchers have used it to detect disease outbreaks early. Since your friends are statistically more central in the network, monitoring them can reveal trends sooner than random sampling. What feels like a personal distortion can become a societal tool. The paradox also highlights inequality. In networks, a small percentage of people often hold disproportionate influence. Algorithms reward visibility, boosting their reach further. This creates a rich get richer effect, not with money, but with attention and impact. So, what can we do? First, understand that the paradox is structural, not personal. It's a lens issue, not a life issue. Second, be mindful of how you use social media. Curate your feed, engage meaningfully, and value depth over breadth. True connection isn't about numbers, it's about authenticity. Ultimately, the friendship paradox offers insight into how our social perception is shaped. It urges us to rethink what it means to be connected. The next time you feel like everyone else is ahead, pause. The network is tilted, the view is distorted, and you're not alone in feeling that way. Value paradox. You're crawling through a scorching desert. Your lips are cracked, your vision blurs. Ahead, two objects glint in the sand, a brilliant cut diamond and a half-full bottle of clean water. There's no contest. The diamond might be worth millions, but in that moment, it's useless. The water is life. And yet, back in civilization, the diamond would be locked under glass while the water might cost less than $1. This contradiction lies at the heart of the value paradox, also known as the diamond-water paradox. How can something essential be cheap while something non-essential is expensive? The question puzzled even Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. He noted the strange truth. Water, vital for life, is often priced low, while diamonds, mere luxuries, hold extreme value. Smith distinguished between use value and exchange value. Water has immense use value. We need it to survive. But its abundance often keeps its market price low. Diamonds have little use but are rare and culturally desired, giving them high exchange value. This paradox reveals something crucial. Markets don't value what's important. They value what's scarce and desirable. Value is not intrinsic. it's contextual. In the desert, water becomes priceless. In a jewelry store, the diamond regains its status. The environment reshapes what we consider valuable. Modern economics addresses this with marginal utility theory. The first glass of water has high utility when you're thirsty. The 10th does not. If water is plentiful, additional units lose value. Diamonds, being rare, retain value no matter how many you own. But the paradox also raises deeper questions beyond economics. Why do we chase symbols of status over sources of sustenance? Why do we take essentials for granted while glorifying luxury? You can see this distortion everywhere. Caregivers, nurses, and teachers, those who hold society together, are underpaid. Celebrities and influencers amass wealth for symbolic value. Natural resources like forests, air, or clean water are overlooked until they become scarce. This paradox reminds us that markets reflect preference, not meaning. They mirror desire and scarcity, not true worth. But when the things we ignore become rare, their value surges, and often too late. With climate change and growing scarcity, water is already becoming more valuable than gold in many regions. The value paradox is no longer hypothetical, it's reality. Our illusion of abundance is fragile. So what does the value paradox ask us? Not just why diamonds cost more than water, but what do we truly value? Are our priorities shaped by truth or by habit and culture? The lesson is sobering. The most precious things are often those we overlook until their absence becomes unbearable. And by then, the cost is not just financial, it's existential. Crocodile Paradox. Your child has just been snatched by a crocodile. You're standing helplessly at the edge of a murky river, panic flooding your mind. Your heart races uncontrollably, your breath is short and shallow, and your hands tremble as the cold realization of the situation begins to sink in. Then, as if in a nightmare, the crocodile slowly turns its head and looks at you with lifeless, unblinking eyes. It speaks, not with a growl or roar, but with calm, deliberate words. I will return your child to you, but only if you can correctly guess what I will do next. In that single moment, time seems to freeze. What you're facing is not just a tragic encounter with a predator, it's a perfect trap of logic. What appears at first to be a cruel riddle becomes something far more profound. This is the infamous Crocodile Paradox, a philosophical dilemma that has baffled thinkers for centuries. On the surface, it may look like a sinister puzzle with a dangerous stake, but beneath it lies a maze of logical tension and philosophical depth. You are presented with two possible predictions, and each path quickly tangles into a web of contradiction. Let's examine the first path. Suppose you predict that the crocodile will return your child. If the crocodile had indeed intended to return your child, your prediction aligns with its plan, and it keeps its word. Your child is safe, the deal is honored, and everything seems logically consistent. However, if the crocodile was planning to keep your child, then your guess is incorrect, and because you were wrong, the crocodile is not obligated to return the child. In this first scenario, the terms of the deal seem to work. Your prediction either matches the outcome or it doesn't, and consequences follow accordingly. But now let's explore the second scenario, where the true paradox emerges. Imagine you guess that the crocodile will not return your child. If the crocodile really does intend to keep your child, then your prediction is correct. But here's the catch. According to the condition it set, if your prediction is correct, it must return the child. Now the crocodile faces a contradiction. It must both keep the child, as it intended, and return the child, because you guessed correctly. That's logically impossible. On the other hand, If the crocodile was planning to return the child, then your prediction was incorrect, meaning that it should not return the child. Again, contradiction. The crocodile finds itself trapped by its own rules. What begins as a bizarre story about a parent and a crocodile becomes a philosophical thought experiment that challenges the structure of logical systems. This is what's known as a self-referential paradox, a situation where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a cycle or contradiction. It bears a striking resemblance to the liar paradox. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it's false. But if it's false, then it must be true. Just like that, the crocodile's promise loops into itself, collapsing under the weight of its internal logic. Yet, the Crocodile Paradox is more than just a logical brain teaser. It invites us to reflect on the nature of promises, truth, and trust. When someone makes a promise, we typically assume that it is something that can, in principle, be fulfilled. But what if the conditions of the promise are structured in a way that no outcome is logically possible? Does that promise still hold any meaning? In the Crocodile Paradox, the very rules of the game ensure that at least one of the parties will always be violated. This opens up unsettling questions. Are some promises inherently deceptive? Can trust exist when the system itself is flawed? This thought experiment also reveals something deeper about systems of power. The crocodile, in this context, is not just a beast enforcing a twisted logic. It is the creator of the rules, the architect of the trap. It offers a deal that is impossible to fairly resolve and retains control no matter how the other party responds. This dynamic can be seen in real-world structures of authority, where systems, institutions, or individuals wield their power by creating conditions that are contradictory, misleading, or impossible to navigate. Legal loopholes, political contradictions, and manipulative contracts are all modern reflections of the crocodile's logic. So, can this paradox be resolved? Philosophers and logicians have debated it for generations, and the consensus is largely this: it is not meant to have a clean solution. Rather, it is a philosophical mirror, designed not to be answered but to be examined. Its purpose is to illuminate the fragile seams of our assumptions about logic, language, and fairness. In the end, the Crocodile Paradox offers a powerful lesson. Not all questions have answers. Not all traps can be escaped. And sometimes the wisest path forward is not to fight the rules, but to understand that the game itself is broken. When you recognize the structure of the trap, you begin to see beyond it. That insight, quiet and unsettling, is what gives this paradox its enduring power. It doesn't just trick the mind, it reveals it. Bootstrap Paradox. You find an old, weathered notebook in the attic. The handwriting is familiar, too familiar. Flipping through the pages, you realize it contains breakthrough theories, ideas you've only begun to imagine. The final page is signed by you, but the date is from 50 years ago. Confused and shaken, you trace the notebook's journey. It turns out you're the one who brings it back in time, placing it where your younger self will one day find it. The knowledge never had a true origin. It was passed from you to you. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a time travel conundrum so puzzling it bends not just clocks, but logic itself. It's a paradox that doesn't rely on contradiction or misdirection, but something far subtler and stranger. It's a loop without a starting point, a cycle where cause and effect collapse into each other. And it asks a question as eerie as it is profound. If something exists only because it causes itself to exist, did it ever truly begin? The name comes from the old expression, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, a metaphor for doing the impossible. In the paradox, the impossible becomes reality. The classic thought experiment involves a time traveler who gives a younger version of themselves the blueprints to a time machine. That younger self builds it, grows older, and eventually becomes the person who delivers the blueprints in the past. The time machine exists, but who actually invented it? The knowledge seems to appear from nowhere, looping endlessly through time. Logically, the paradox breaks one of the fundamental assumptions of causality, that every effect must have a cause. In the bootstrap loop, the cause and effect are the same. The time traveler builds the machine because they received the plans from their future self, but that future self only had the plans because they were passed down. There is no outside origin. The chain of causation is circular. This doesn't merely challenge our intuitions, it distorts them. We rely on linear time to understand reality. First, a thing is created. Then it exists. Then it acts. In the Bootstrap Paradox, this sequence is scrambled. Creation and existence happen simultaneously. The line between before and after, origin and result, is erased. And without a first cause, we're left with an object or an idea that exists simply because it exists. The paradox has intrigued not only philosophers, but physicists as well. Within the framework of general relativity, closed time-like curves, CTCs, are theoretical paths through spacetime that could allow such loops. While still speculative, the math permits their possibility. If they were real, the bootstrap scenario might not violate physics. It would just violate everything we thought we knew about how cause and effect should behave. This makes the paradox especially powerful in storytelling. From science fiction films like Predestination and 12 Monkeys to novels like The Time Traveler's Wife, writers use the Bootstrap Paradox to evoke wonder, confusion, and philosophical awe. A character might receive a message from the future, act on it, and in doing so become the very source of that message. The story feeds itself, but there's a darker side to the loop. The Bootstrap Paradox forces us to ask unsettling questions. If knowledge or technology, or even people, can exist without origin, what does that say about meaning, responsibility, or agency? If you didn't invent the time machine, even though you built it, are you really its creator? If ideas can emerge without thought, how do we define authorship or truth? The paradox also touches on deeper philosophical terrain. It mirrors ancient questions about the universe itself. If the cosmos began with the Big Bang, what caused the Big Bang? And if that cause was itself caused, where did it all begin? Some speculative models of the universe suggest time could be cyclic, endlessly repeating itself. In such a model, the universe could be its own bootstrap, born not from a single origin, but from a loop with no beginning. Still, most scientists remain skeptical of true bootstrap scenarios. They argue that even if time travel becomes possible, paradoxes like this may be prohibited by some yet unknown principle of nature, a chronology protection conjecture. As Stephen Hawking once suggested, the universe, he proposed, may simply forbid time travel to the past, precisely because of the problems it creates. But whether or not such paradoxes can occur physically, they remain profoundly useful as intellectual tools. The Bootstrap Paradox isn't just about time travel. It's about self-reference, about the boundaries of logic, about the strangeness of a universe where not everything needs a beginning. It forces us to reconsider linearity, identity, and the nature of information itself. So where does the paradox leave us? Like all great paradoxes, it doesn't offer closure, it opens a door. It invites us to question assumptions we didn't even know we had. It reminds tolerance, paradox. You're standing in a public square. Around you, voices rise in debate, passionate, angry, insistent. On one side, a group is defending open dialogue, equal rights, and the freedom to speak, no matter how controversial the view. On the other side, a crowd is rallying behind slogans of hate, exclusion, and violence, demanding silence for those who differ from them. As tensions escalate, you realize the terrible irony. In the name of tolerance, the intolerant are given space to grow. You look around, confused. What does it mean to defend free expression when some voices seek to silence others? How far can freedom stretch before it begins to destroy itself? This is no longer just a political dilemma, it's a moral paradox wrapped in the very fabric of modern society, and it has a name: the Tolerance Paradox. First proposed by philosopher Karl Popper in his 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, the paradox asks a difficult question. Should a tolerant society tolerate the intolerant? At first glance, it seems contradictory. If you believe in tolerance, shouldn't that mean accepting all views, even those that reject tolerance itself? But here lies the trap. Let's examine the structure. Imagine a society that holds tolerance as its highest virtue. In such a society, every idea, belief, and worldview is given room to breathe. Disagreement is welcomed, dialogue encouraged. But then enters an ideology that does not believe in dialogue, one that seeks not to participate, but to dominate, one that sees tolerance not as a value, but as a weakness to be exploited. It uses the freedoms given to it to undermine those very freedoms. If left unchecked, it begins to grow. It silences dissent. It dismantles the pluralism that gave it voice in the first place. If a tolerant society allows this to happen in the name of neutrality or fairness, it may not remain tolerant for long. This is the beating heart of the paradox. If we are tolerant of intolerance, intolerance will eventually destroy tolerance. The enemy of the open society doesn't need to defeat it with violence. It only needs to be allowed in through the front door. Karl Popper's response to the paradox was unapologetic. He argued that tolerance must have boundaries. A tolerant society should be willing to tolerate anything, except the ideology that would annihilate tolerance itself. This doesn't mean suppressing ideas we dislike or avoiding uncomfortable conversations. It means drawing the line when beliefs are weaponized into actions that aim to silence, exclude, or harm. But here's where things become ethically murky. Who decides what counts as intolerant? Can such power be wielded without abuse? What prevents a society from silencing inconvenient truths under the pretense of defending tolerance? These are not easy questions. The paradox opens the door to another danger: intolerance in the name of tolerance. If the standard becomes too vague or too harsh, it risks becoming the very thing it was meant to oppose. The cure becomes the disease. This tension is what makes the tolerance paradox so haunting. It offers no perfect resolution, only a set of difficult trade-offs. This isn't just theory. History is littered with examples. In pre-World War II Germany, democratic tolerance allowed extremist parties to rise, using free speech and electoral participation to dismantle the system from within. In the end, the Nazis didn't need to crush democracy through war. It handed them the keys willingly. The price of unrestricted tolerance was devastation. And in today's world, the paradox rears its head again. Online platforms grapple with whether to allow hate speech under the banner of free speech. Universities debate who should be given a platform to speak. Democracies confront populist movements that openly disdain democratic norms. In each case, society is caught in the same bind. How do you defend openness without inviting its undoing? The tolerance paradox is more than a philosophical riddle. It's a mirror held up to the values we claim to cherish. It forces us to admit that even our most noble principles, freedom, openness, inclusion, are vulnerable. And like all good paradoxes, it asks us to live in the tension, not resolve it. So, what can we take from this? First, tolerance is not the same as moral passivity. It is an active stance, requiring judgment, responsibility, and sometimes uncomfortable action. It is not the refusal to discriminate. It is the wisdom to know when and why discrimination is necessary to protect the very system we wish to preserve. Second, defending tolerance requires moral courage. It means standing up not only for the rights of others to speak, but also for the rights of a society to set limits on speech that corrodes its foundations. And third, tolerance is not infinite. Its strength lies in knowing its limits. Without those limits, it becomes brittle, breakable, a noble but doomed ideal. In the end, the tolerance paradox doesn't tell us exactly where to draw the line. It tells us we must draw it and live with the consequences. It asks us to embrace the tension between freedom and protection, to guard the open society not with silence or submission, but with thoughtful resistance. So the next time someone says, "We should accept all views," ask yourself, even the ones that would silence everyone else? That is the question the paradox leaves in your hands, not to solve, but to carry. Paradox of choice. Imagine walking into an ice cream shop. You're craving something sweet and refreshing, and you're ready to treat yourself. But instead of the usual 5 or 6 flavors, you're greeted with 50 options. Chocolate, vanilla, pistachio, salted caramel, mango sorbet, rocky road, lavender honey, lemon basil, and dozens more. At first, you're thrilled, so many possibilities. But then, something strange happens. You begin to feel stressed. You second-guess yourself. What if you pick pistachio and regret not choosing salted caramel? What if rocky road would have been your perfect flavor? What should have been a joyful decision turns into an exhausting internal debate. This experience is the essence of the paradox of choice, a psychological concept that challenges one of the central assumptions of modern life, that more choices lead to more freedom and greater happiness. In reality, too many options can overwhelm us, lead to decision paralysis, and ultimately make us less satisfied, even when we do make a choice. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this idea in his book, The Paradox of Choice. Why more is less? He argued that while having some choice is undoubtedly better than none, there's a tipping point where the abundance of options becomes counterproductive. When we're faced with too many possibilities, we become anxious about making the wrong choice. We spend more time and mental energy deciding, and we're more likely to experience regret afterward. Consider something as simple as choosing a movie to watch on a streaming platform. With hundreds of titles at your fingertips, you might spend 30 minutes scrolling, watching trailers and reading reviews, only to settle for something familiar or give up entirely. This is decision fatigue, a state where the cognitive load of choosing leaves us drained and less able to make a satisfying decision. We want the best, but we often settle for what's good enough, if we manage to choose at all. But the paradox of choice doesn't just lead to indecision, it also affects how we feel about our decisions afterward. Let's say you finally choose salted caramel. As you eat it, you can't stop wondering whether you would have enjoyed pistachio more. This is called post-decision regret, and it can taint even good experiences. The more choices we have, the more opportunities there are to imagine alternatives, and the more likely we are to feel we've missed out. Another factor at play is the rise in our expectations. When only a few options are available, we're more likely to be content with what we get. But when the options are nearly endless, we expect perfection. And if our choice doesn't completely blow us away, we feel let down. Not necessarily because it was bad, but because it didn't live up to the imagined ideal. More options lead to higher expectations, and higher expectations lead to greater disappointment. This paradox doesn't affect everyone equally. People known as maximizers feel compelled to find the absolute best option in every situation. They do exhaustive research, compare every possibility, and often end up more frustrated and less satisfied. In contrast, satisficers look for options that are good enough. They make quicker decisions and tend to be happier with the outcomes, even if they didn't explore every possible alternative. In today's world, this paradox is more relevant than ever. We're surrounded by choice. What to eat, what to wear, what phone to buy, what career to pursue, who to date, where to live. The list is endless. Technology has removed many of the barriers to access and increased the availability of options in almost every aspect of life. While this can be empowering, it also creates a constant pressure to optimize every decision. So how do we escape this trap? One solution is to embrace the idea of good enough. Instead of chasing the perfect choice, we can focus on making decisions that meet our needs and values without obsessing over every alternative. Setting clear criteria beforehand and sticking to them can also help limit the scope of our decisions. Another strategy is to simplify. Give yourself fewer options. For example, choose from the first 5 movies that appear on your screen, or commit to a restaurant before looking at the menu. By reducing the number of decisions we have to make, we preserve mental energy and reduce regret. The paradox of choice also invites us to reflect on what truly makes us happy. It's easy to assume that external options, products, experiences, opportunities are the path to fulfillment. But real happiness often comes from within: meaningful relationships, purposeful work, a sense of belonging. These things aren't about choosing from hundreds of options. They're about depth, not breadth. It also helps to shift our mindset about choices. Instead of framing each decision as a test of our judgment or a gateway to the best possible life, we can view it as an experiment. Every decision becomes a learning opportunity, not a referendum on our worth. This perspective reduces the pressure and helps us feel more confident in navigating an option-rich world. Ultimately, the paradox of choice is not a call to reject choice altogether. It's a call to be more intentional, to recognize when the freedom of choice begins to weigh us down, to remember that the goal of choice is not to have everything, but to find enough, and to be at peace with that. In the end, the paradox of choice isn't just about consumer behavior. It's a reflection of how we navigate modern life. It challenges us to rethink what freedom really means and how we can use our freedom wisely. True freedom doesn't come from having unlimited choices. It comes from knowing what matters to you and having the clarity to choose it without regret. Ship of Theseus Paradox. If you replace every part of a ship, plank by plank over time, is it still the same ship? This classic philosophical riddle, known as the Ship of Theseus Paradox, challenges our understanding of identity, continuity, and change. It's not just a question about boats, it's a mirror reflecting the essence of what it means to persist through transformation. The story goes back to ancient Greece. The Athenians preserved the ship of the mythical hero Theseus, replacing its decaying timbers over the years. Eventually, none of the original parts remained. Philosophers then asked, is it still the same ship? And to complicate matters, what if someone took all the discarded pieces and rebuilt the original ship elsewhere? Which one is the real ship of Theseus? The one that evolved or the one reconstructed? The paradox cuts to the heart of identity. What defines a thing as itself over time? Is it its material components, its structure, its function, or something more abstract, its history, continuity, or perception? The question has no simple answer, and that's precisely its power. This thought experiment applies far beyond maritime metaphysics. Consider your own body. Almost every cell in it regenerates over time. The physical matter you were born with is mostly gone. Are you still the same person? Or think about a city. As buildings are torn down and rebuilt, roads repaved, and populations shift, does it remain the same place? Some philosophers argue that identity is tied to continuity of function. As long as the ship sails, it remains the ship of Theseus. This is similar to how we see people. Even as we change physically, emotionally, and intellectually, there's a sense of self that endures. Others claim material continuity is essential, so the rebuilt ship from the original parts is the true one. Then there's a more modern interpretation. Identity isn't absolute, but relational and contextual. In this view, both ships are the ship of Theseus, in different senses. The paradox doesn't require choosing one or the other. It invites us to see identity as a narrative, not a fixed point. This concept resonates deeply in our age of rapid change. Technology upgrades, companies rebrand, relationships evolve. We are constantly asked to recognize continuity amid flux. The ship of Theseus paradox reminds us that identity is not static. It's shaped by memory, intention, and the stories we tell. It also informs debates in artificial intelligence, digital identity, and even ethics. If a human mind could be uploaded into a machine, would the consciousness that emerges be the same person? If a person gradually replaces their body parts with cybernetic implants, at what point do they stop being human, or do they ever? Psychologically, the paradox mirrors our own self-concept. We grow, we learn, we grieve, we heal, yet something inside tells us we are still us. This intuition is powerful, but it resists precise definition. Perhaps what persists is not a thing, but a thread, an evolving sense of self woven through memory, connection, and choice. Culturally, the ship of Theseus also offers insight into how communities preserve identity. Traditions adapt, languages shift, customs evolve, yet groups maintain a sense of who they are, rooted in a shared story, even as the details change. Identity then becomes not an anchor, but a sail, something that holds direction while adapting to the winds. So, how do we live with this paradox? By embracing it. Change is inevitable, but it doesn't have to mean disintegration. The ship of Theseus teaches us to honor continuity without fearing transformation. It invites us to see that we are both the same and not the same, that our identities are both inherited and invented. In the end, the ship of Theseus isn't about finding a final answer. It's about deepening our understanding of what it means to be, to persist, and to evolve. Whether you're pondering a ship, a city, a person, or a culture, the paradox offers a powerful reminder. Identity is not a thing we hold. It's a journey we navigate. Sorites Paradox. How many grains of sand make a heap? 1, 10, 1,000? This deceptively simple question lies at the heart of the Sorites Paradox, a puzzle that challenges our understanding of vague concepts and gradual change. At first glance, it might seem like a linguistic trick or a philosophical game, but at its core, the Sorites Paradox exposes profound questions about how we define and navigate the blurry edges of reality. The paradox gets its name from the Greek word soros, meaning heap. It goes like this: 1 grain of sand doesn't make a heap. If 1 grain isn't a heap, then adding just 1 more shouldn't suddenly turn it into one. But if you keep adding grains, grain by grain, at what point does the pile become a heap? And if no single grain makes the difference, then how can any collection of grains be a heap at all? This problem of vagueness isn't limited to sand. It appears in countless everyday situations. When does someone go from being tall to short, young to old, rich to poor? If losing a single hair doesn't make you bald, then at what point does baldness begin? These concepts, heap, baldness, wealth, don't have clear boundaries. They exist in gray areas, and that's what makes them so tricky. The Sorites Paradox illustrates the limitations of binary thinking. We like to sort the world into neat categories, yes or no, is or isn't. But many aspects of life don't fit cleanly into boxes. Language, perception, and even laws often rely on fuzzy distinctions. And when we try to impose strict definitions on vague concepts, contradictions arise. One proposed solution to the paradox is to accept degrees. Instead of asking when a heap begins, we consider that heapness is a matter of degree. A few grains are a very small heap. 100 grains are a small heap. 1,000 grains might be a large heap. This approach introduces a continuum where properties can gradually increase rather than switch on or off. But this, too, has its challenges. Where do we draw the lines, and who gets to decide? Another response is contextualism. In some contexts, 50 grains might be called a heap, say, on a desk, but the same pile on a beach might be dismissed as insignificant. According to this view, meaning depends on situation and comparison. Words don't have fixed meanings. They adapt based on use and expectation. This helps in practice, but it doesn't eliminate the underlying ambiguity. Philosophers and logicians have long debated these issues. Some argue that vague terms are inherently flawed and should be replaced with more precise language. Others believe that vagueness is an essential part of how we understand the world. After all, real life rarely offers sharp edges. Most of our experiences, feelings, and judgments live in the in-between. The Sorites Paradox also has implications for law and ethics. Legal terms like reasonable doubt, excessive force, or negligence are intentionally vague to allow for flexibility. But this vagueness can lead to inconsistency, disagreement, or manipulation. When does punishment become cruel? When does protest become violence? These are not just semantic questions. They shape real lives and policies. In science and medicine, too, categories are often fuzzy. Consider the diagnosis of a disease. At what point do symptoms become severe enough to warrant a label? How many traits must a condition show before it qualifies as a syndrome? These thresholds are often set by consensus, not certainty, and the Sorites Paradox reminds us to be cautious in treating such lines as absolute. More broadly, the paradox speaks to the nature of change. We evolve not in sudden leaps, but through accumulation. Identities, beliefs, relationships, even societies. They shift gradually, often imperceptibly, until one day we realize we've crossed an invisible line. The Sorites Paradox captures this mystery of transformation, how small steps can lead to large shifts, even when no single step seems decisive. So, what can we learn from this ancient puzzle? First, humility. The world is complex, and our tools for describing it are imperfect. Precision is valuable, but it's not always possible. We must learn to navigate uncertainty, to tolerate ambiguity, and to listen closely to context. Second, awareness. When dealing with vague concepts, whether in conversation, law, or personal judgment, we should recognize their fluidity. Being open to nuance allows for more thoughtful, compassionate, and adaptable thinking. Finally, the Sorites Paradox teaches us that change doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives grain by grain, moment by moment, and before we know it, the heap has formed and we've stepped into a new reality. It's not just about sand, it's about the subtle forces that shape everything. Hedonism Paradox. What if the more you chase happiness, the more it slips away? This is the Hedonism Paradox, a concept that reveals an ironic truth about human fulfillment. The direct pursuit of pleasure often leads not to joy, but to disappointment, anxiety, and emptiness. In seeking happiness above all else, we may find ourselves farther from it. Hedonism, as a philosophy, suggests that pleasure is the highest good, the ultimate aim of life. Whether it's savoring delicious food, enjoying music, traveling, or spending time with loved ones, the hedonistic approach views these experiences as the path to a meaningful existence. And indeed, pleasure and happiness are fundamental human desires. But the paradox emerges when we turn happiness into a goal rather than a byproduct. Imagine attending a party with the intention of having the best night of your life. You've planned everything: what to wear, who to talk to, what to drink. But as the evening unfolds, you constantly check in with yourself. Am I having fun yet? You compare your experience to others, wonder if you're missing out, and find yourself distracted rather than delighted. The harder you try to force happiness, the more elusive it becomes. This is the Hedonism Paradox in action. Psychologists refer to this as the paradoxical effect, when focusing too much on an outcome makes achieving it more difficult. Happiness, it turns out, is not something you can will into existence. It often arises indirectly, as a side effect of engaging deeply with activities that matter to you. Whether it's creating art, helping others, learning something new, or simply being present, joy often sneaks up on us when we're not looking for it. Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl expressed this idea powerfully. Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. In his view, purpose and meaning are more reliable paths to fulfillment than pleasure alone. When we commit to something larger than ourselves, whether a cause, a relationship, or a creative pursuit, happiness follows as a natural consequence. Modern research in positive psychology supports this view. Studies show that people who focus on intrinsic goals, personal growth, connection, community, tend to report higher life satisfaction than those who chase extrinsic rewards like wealth, fame, or image. The paradox, then, is not that pleasure is bad, but that pleasure alone is not enough. Social media and modern culture amplify the hedonism paradox. We're bombarded with curated images of others' happiness, vacations, achievements, celebrations. This creates an unrealistic standard for what happiness should look like and makes our own moments feel inadequate by comparison. In trying to match this ideal, we may engage in constant evaluation, always wondering, am I happy enough? This self-monitoring undermines our ability to simply be. So how can we escape the trap? One approach is mindfulness. By focusing on the present moment without judgment, we reduce the pressure to feel a certain way. Mindfulness teaches us to notice our thoughts and emotions without being ruled by them. Instead of chasing happiness, we learn to cultivate awareness, gratitude, and acceptance. Another strategy is to engage in activities for their own sake. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi coined the term flow to describe the state of complete absorption in a task. Whether it's writing, playing music, gardening, or sports, flow activities remove self-consciousness and create a sense of timelessness. In flow, we forget to ask whether we're happy, and in doing so, we often are. We can also reframe our relationship to negative emotions. Happiness isn't the absence of pain or difficulty. Life includes stress, sadness, and setbacks. When we accept these as natural parts of the human experience, we stop chasing a fantasy of uninterrupted joy. In fact, moments of contrast, after hardship, in the quiet after chaos, can heighten our appreciation of life's simple pleasures. The hedonism paradox doesn't tell us to avoid joy, it tells us to stop grasping for it. Real happiness is often found not by turning inward and asking, "Am I happy?" but by turning outward and asking, what gives my life meaning? When we live in alignment with our values, connect authentically with others, and engage fully in the present, happiness tends to follow. In the end, the paradox reminds us that the pursuit of happiness is not a race to be won or a problem to be solved. It's a rhythm to be lived, a side effect of purpose, presence, and participation in life. When we stop chasing happiness and start living with intention, we just might find that joy arrives quietly, faithfully, and often when we least expect it. Catch-22 Paradox. Imagine a situation where the only way to escape is to prove you're insane, but trying to escape is considered proof that you're sane. This is the essence of the Catch-22 Paradox, a scenario where any attempt to break free only reinforces the trap. It's a loop of logic that defeats itself, revealing the absurdities of bureaucracy, authority, and circular reasoning. The term Catch-22 was coined by Joseph Heller in his 1961 novel of the same name. In the book, a World War II bombardier named Yossarian wants to be excused from flying dangerous missions. The military rule states that a pilot can be grounded if he's insane, but if he requests to be grounded, that shows he has concern for his safety, a perfectly rational response. Therefore, he must be sane. And if he doesn't ask to be grounded, he continues flying, trapped in a no-win situation. The genius of Catch-22 is how it captures the maddening logic of closed systems, rules designed to justify themselves, institutions that trap individuals under the guise of rationality. It's a paradox of modern life, where control masquerades as order and escape routes are illusions. Catch-22s appear everywhere. Consider job seekers applying for entry-level positions that require years of experience, or people trying to build credit but being denied credit because they have no history, or trying to see a specialist but needing a referral from a doctor they can't get an appointment with. These are real-world manifestations of the Catch-22, structures so rigid they defeat their own purpose. At their core, Catch-22s expose the gap between rules and reality. Systems are meant to provide order and fairness, but when the rules become inflexible or self-referential, they collapse into absurdity. Logic twists into contradiction, and those caught in the loop are left helpless, frustrated, and often invisible. The Catch-22 paradox also reveals deeper truths about power. In a true Catch-22, the person trying to break free has no leverage. The system controls the terms, the criteria, and the outcome. This asymmetry reflects how institutions can entrench authority by framing compliance as rational and dissent as madness. This isn't just a literary device. It's a social critique. Bureaucracies in government, corporations, education, and healthcare often operate under similar paradoxes. They offer procedures that seem fair on paper, but in practice become mazes of contradiction and delay. Those most in need, whether it's veterans, students, patients, or the unemployed, find themselves most tangled in these loops. Catch-22 also has a psychological dimension. Think of someone struggling with depression who's told, just get help. But their symptoms make it nearly impossible to seek help in the first place. Or someone told to be confident to succeed, but who needs success to feel confident? The logic traps extend inward, shaping how we view ourselves and our choices. So, how do we respond to a Catch-22? Awareness is the first step. Recognizing the paradox allows us to see the trap for what it is, not a personal failure, but a structural flaw. This can be empowering, especially when it lifts the weight of guilt or confusion. In some cases, the only solution is to change the system, to rewrite the rule. That might mean reforming policy, simplifying procedures, or creating alternatives that prioritize compassion and context over rigid logic. But until that change happens, people often find creative ways to navigate the paradox. Workarounds, loopholes, and collective action become forms of resistance. Humor, too, is a powerful tool. Joseph Heller's novel doesn't just describe the absurdity, it mocks it. Laughter, satire, and storytelling can puncture the illusion of invincibility that such systems project. They remind us that even in the most senseless circumstances, the human spirit endures. In the end, the Catch-22 paradox isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a lens through which we can understand the contradictions of modern life. It teaches us that reason can be used to obscure truth, that rules can entrench injustice, and that escape sometimes requires imagination as much as action. So, the next time you find yourself stuck in a loop that logic can't resolve, remember, the problem might not be you. It might be the rulebook and the paradoxes it was built to hide. Stability-Instability Paradox. What if the more stable the world becomes, the more likely conflict is to erupt? It begins with silence. Not peace, not resolution, just the quiet hum of tension beneath a surface that seems calm. You're in a war room, staring at a map filled with borders, blinking red dots and long histories. Two great powers face off across oceans. Both possess weapons that could end civilization, and yet, neither acts. For decades, they've stared at each other across that invisible line, held in check by fear. The balance is fragile, but stable. And then, you zoom in. You see proxy wars flaring in the margins, small nations bleeding in conflicts sparked by ideology, resources, or revenge. The giants won't move, but their shadows start fires elsewhere. The paradox reveals itself. Global stability breeds local instability. This is the Stability-Instability Paradox. Coined during the Cold War by nuclear strategists, the paradox explains a strange, dangerous logic. When two powerful adversaries are deterred from all-out war, often by mutual destruction, they become more willing to engage in smaller, indirect conflicts. Because the ultimate threat is off the table, risk feels safer. Let's rewind to the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear firepower to obliterate each other and the planet. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, ensured that neither side dared push too far. But this didn't mean peace. Instead, conflict found new homes. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Latin America. Each side armed, funded, and encouraged factions, not directly fighting, but manipulating the field. The paradox is clear. The more secure the superpowers felt from total war, the more emboldened they became in smaller skirmishes. It's not just history, it's logic. Imagine you live in a neighborhood where two feuding families each hold a gun. Neither wants to fire first, knowing it would lead to mutual ruin. But while they avoid a direct shootout, they sabotage each other's cars, poison reputations, and hire others to fight for them. The gun keeps them from war, but enables endless acts of lower-level aggression. This dynamic extends far beyond geopolitics. Take cybersecurity. As global systems grow more sophisticated and digital defenses more robust, full-scale attacks become less likely. But small hacks, data leaks, and misinformation campaigns, they're everywhere. The deterrent of catastrophic failure encourages smaller, calculated risks. Or look at economic systems. When governments prop up industries to avoid collapse through bailouts or stimulus, actors feel safe. That safety can encourage reckless risk-taking, leading to financial bubbles and crashes. The illusion of stability becomes a breeding ground for instability. Even in relationships, the pattern appears. Two people may avoid confrontation in the name of preserving peace, suppressing conflict instead of resolving it. But the unspoken tension leaks out. Sarcasm, avoidance, small betrayals. The relationship becomes emotionally volatile beneath the calm. So, what's really going on here? At its heart, the Stability-Instability Paradox is a lesson in strategic psychology. When we know the worst won't happen, we're more willing to test the boundaries. Fear of escalation keeps actors restrained. Remove that fear, and they start to explore the gray zone, where the rules are unclear and the costs are lower. But here's the twist. Those smaller conflicts often spiral. Skirmishes become wars. Hacks become international incidents. Passive aggression becomes divorce. The paradox is not just about cause, it's about fragility. Systems built on suppressed tension eventually crack. The paradox forces us to ask, can true stability exist if it only hides the seeds of future chaos? Real-world implications abound. The US and China, two nuclear powers, may never go to war. But tensions bubble in Taiwan, trade policies, and technological sabotage. In Israel and Iran's shadow conflict, open war is avoided, yet proxies battle across the region. NATO's presence deters large-scale European war, yet hybrid threats, cyber attacks, disinformation, proliferate. The lesson is this: deterrence doesn't mean peace, it means displacement. And so, we must think differently. Stability, if it is to be real and lasting, cannot depend on threats alone. It must be built on communication, trust, and systems that resolve, not just postpone, conflict. Otherwise, the calm is just a pause between storms. So, can the paradox be broken? Perhaps not entirely, but it can be recognized. By understanding the incentive structures that power it, we can begin to shift them. That means more than avoiding war. It means building diplomacy that doesn't just restrain, but listens. Economies that don't just bail out, but reform. Relationships that don't just avoid conflict, but heal it. In the end, the Stability-Instability Paradox is a warning. True peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice, dialogue, and balance. A world held together only by fear is a world still at risk. So the next time things seem calm, ask what's beneath the surface. Ask if peace is real, or if we're just frozen, waiting for the next small flame to find dry kindling. Because sometimes it's not the earthquake that topples the house, it's the silence right before the walls give in. Paradox of Thrift. It's a stormy evening. You sit at the kitchen table staring at your monthly budget, a cold cup of tea at your side. Outside thunder rolls and you make a decision. We need to cut back. No more dinners out, no vacations, save every spare coin, just in case. It's a sensible choice, responsible, protective. But then, as you scroll the news, you see headlines of businesses closing, jobs vanishing, a recession deepening. You wonder, what happened? What if you were not alone? What if everyone, everywhere, made the same decision you did? Welcome to the paradox of thrift, a concept so counterintuitive it sounds like a contradiction, because it is. At its core, the paradox states this: while saving is good for an individual, it can be disastrous if everyone does it at once. The idea first rose to prominence with economist John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression. Imagine a town where people suddenly stop spending to save more. At first, it seems wise. Families are being careful. But as fewer people eat out, shop, or travel, businesses suffer. They lay off workers. Those workers now spend less, and the spiral begins. What is prudent on a small scale becomes dangerous on a large one. Let's break down the logic. In a healthy economy, one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy a coffee, you support the barista. When the barista buys groceries, they support the store clerk. Money flows, but when saving rises sharply across the board, especially during a downturn, the flow of money slows. Demand weakens, businesses cut back, unemployment rises. Ironically, the very act of saving meant to protect individuals creates the very environment that threatens them. This is the paradox. Keynes framed it as a fallacy of composition, the mistaken belief that what is true of the part must be true of the whole. Just as standing up at a concert might help one person see better, it won't help if the entire audience stands. Likewise, saving helps the individual, but if everyone saves and no one spends, the entire system falters. But is saving really the villain here? Not exactly. The paradox isn't a condemnation of thrift, but a warning about timing and scale. Saving is essential during economic booms. It funds investment, builds capital, and ensures long-term growth. The problem arises during recessions, when demand is already fragile. In such times, economists argue that the role of spending must shift from individuals to governments. Keynes proposed that in times of contraction, governments should step in as the spender of last resort. By investing in infrastructure, education, and public services, they inject money into the economy, stimulate demand, and create jobs. This spending can restart the cycle and restore confidence. But the paradox doesn't just live in spreadsheets, it lives in hearts and minds. During a crisis, fear spreads. People tighten their belts, not out of greed but anxiety. Confidence collapses. And that psychological shift is what gives the paradox its power. It turns emotion into economic consequence. We've seen this play out in history. The Great Depression worsened as families hoarded cash. During the 2008 financial crisis, consumer cutbacks led to waves of bankruptcies. In the COVID-19 pandemic, government stimulus spending was used explicitly to counteract the paradox of thrift. But the paradox also raises deeper philosophical questions. Can we think collectively in a world that rewards individual prudence? Can systems be built that protect both thrift and growth? This isn't just about dollars, it's about values. In many societies, thrift is seen as a virtue. Save for the future. Don't be wasteful. Be self-reliant. These are important principles. But when systems depend on constant consumption to survive, those same virtues become threats. That's the unsettling message of the paradox. In a consumption-driven economy, you must spend to save the whole. So, where does this leave us? Perhaps the solution is not to abandon thrift, but to rethink our systems, to build economies where safety, stability, and sustainability don't require endless consumption. The paradox of thrift is not an indictment of saving. It's a spotlight on the invisible thread that ties our choices to others. It reveals that no one acts in isolation. Your fear ripples into someone else's misfortune. Their restraint into someone else's unemployment. It shows us that economics is not just about math. It's about trust, about timing, about understanding that responsibility is not just personal, it's shared. So, next time you hesitate before spending, ask, is this about caution or fear? Am I helping my future or undermining everyone's present? And remember, in times of crisis, spending isn't just an act of consumption. It's an act of solidarity. Unexpected hanging paradox. The sentence drops like a blade. You will be executed at noon on one weekday next week, but you won't know which day until the hangman comes. A prisoner stands in the courtroom, trying to make sense of the judge's words. He's doomed, but when? Monday? Wednesday? Friday? Then something clicks in his mind. A path to escape, not from the rope, but from the surprise. He starts reasoning. If I'm still alive by Thursday night, it must be Friday. But if I know it will be Friday, it's no longer a surprise, so it can't be Friday. He nods to himself. Friday is impossible. But wait, if Friday's off the table and he's alive by Wednesday night, then Thursday must be the day. But again, if he expects Thursday, it's not a surprise. Strike Thursday. He continues eliminating the days one by one. Eventually, he concludes, the execution can't happen at all. He relaxes, smiles, sleeps peacefully Monday and Tuesday. And on Wednesday at noon, the executioner arrives, and he is utterly shocked. This is the unexpected hanging paradox, a chilling puzzle at the crossroads of logic, knowledge, and self-reference. It's not just a clever story, it's a mind trap. The prisoner's logic seems flawless, and yet he still gets hanged, and he's still surprised. How can that be? The heart of the paradox lies in this contradiction. 1. The judge promises, you will be hanged next week, and it will be a surprise. 2. The prisoner tries to logically eliminate every possible day. 3. But the very fact that he rules out all possibilities ensures that when the hanging does happen, on a day he thought impossible, it is indeed a surprise. In essence, his belief that it couldn't happen is what allows it to happen. This paradox is not just about hanging. It's about how logic can turn against itself when it starts folding inward. Let's unpack the logic. The judge's statement combines certainty, you will be hanged, with uncertainty. It will be a surprise. The prisoner uses backward induction, ruling out each day starting from Friday. But his reasoning assumes that he can eliminate all days without error, that logic can conquer surprise. This is where the trap is set. By trying to fully predict the unpredictable, the prisoner tricks himself into false confidence. And so, when the hangman comes, on a day he already declared impossible, he is caught completely off guard. Philosophical and logical implications. The unexpected. Hanging paradox isn't just a riddle, it's a deep commentary on prediction versus reality. Self-referential logic. Limits of human knowledge, much like the liar paradox. This sentence is false. This thought experiment creates a loop that undermines itself. The prisoner's conclusion that the execution can't happen relies on the assumption that the judge's statement is logically impossible. But once he believes that, he makes himself vulnerable to being proven wrong in the most dramatic way. Real-world parallels. This paradox echoes throughout modern fields. Game theory. When trying to predict an opponent's move, overthinking can cause you to fall into traps you thought you avoided. Security and strategy. Sometimes, overconfidence in planning creates blind spots. Just like the prisoner, organizations can rule out threats because they seem logically impossible. Psychology. Our minds crave certainty, but trying to logic our way out of uncertainty can lead to deeper confusion. It's also a cautionary tale. The more you try to outsmart the unknown, the more vulnerable you become to it. So, what does this paradox ultimately teach us? That certainty can be an illusion. That sometimes the very act of reasoning leads us away from truth. That surprise isn't just the absence of knowledge, it's the collapse of assumptions. The unexpected hanging paradox doesn't give us a tidy answer. It offers something more powerful, a lesson in humility. Because sometimes the most unexpected thing is that your logic failed you. Grand Hotel Paradox. You arrive at the Grand Hotel just as the sun dips behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the infinite stretch of steps leading to the front doors. The sign above the entrance gleams in gold. Welcome, vacancy always. Curious, you walk in, only to find a line of guests stretching beyond the lobby. each holding a key to a room already full. Every room, room 1, room 2, room 3, all the way to room infinity, is occupied. And yet, the receptionist beams and says, "Don't worry, we always have space." That's when it hits you. This isn't a hotel. It's a paradox, one that forces you to rethink the very nature of reality itself. This is the Grand Hotel Paradox, a mind-bending thought experiment proposed by the German mathematician David Hilbert. It is not just a clever trick about a hotel with infinite rooms. It is a doorway into the counterintuitive world of infinity, one where the laws of common sense collapse under the weight of abstract logic. Let's examine how the paradox works. Suppose the hotel has an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. A new guest arrives. Instead of turning them away, the receptionist simply asks every current guest to move to the next room. Room 1 moves to room 2, room 2 to room 3, and so on. Room 1 is now free. The hotel, though full, has made space for one more guest, but it doesn't stop there. What if a bus arrives, not with one person, but with an infinite number of new guests? Once again, the hotel accommodates them. Each current guest is moved to the room number that is double their current one. Room 1 to room 2, room 2 to room 4, room 3 to room 6, leaving all odd-numbered rooms free. An infinite number of spaces have been created. The impossible becomes routine. At its core, the paradox reveals that infinity is not a number, but a concept that defies normal rules. In our everyday world, full means full. If every seat is taken, no more can be added. But in Hilbert's infinite hotel, full doesn't mean there's no room. It means the space can be restructured forever. Infinity isn't a ceiling. It's an invitation to rearrange. This distinction opens up a philosophical and mathematical schism, the difference between potential infinity and actual infinity. Potential infinity describes a process that never ends, like counting 1, 2, 3, and so on. Actual infinity, on the other hand, describes a completed set, like all natural numbers considered as a whole. Hilbert's hotel assumes the latter, confronting us with a reality where the infinite exists all at once. This leads to disturbing yet fascinating consequences. Adding to infinity doesn't increase it, subtracting doesn't decrease it, and parts can be as large as the whole. But this is more than just abstract math. The paradox bleeds into our physical and philosophical world. In cosmology, some theories suggest that the universe itself may be infinite. If that's true, then questions about the number of galaxies, stars, or even alternate versions of ourselves become more than speculative. They become mathematically plausible. In physics, infinity rears its head in black holes, quantum fields, and the very fabric of space-time. The Grand Hotel becomes a metaphor not just for strange math, but for the structure of existence. And yet, the paradox also forces us to question the reliability of intuition. We are creatures evolved to think in finite terms. Days, distances, lifespans. Infinity is alien to our instincts. The hotel feels absurd because it violates everything we know about space and capacity. And that absurdity is the paradox's power. It shakes us awake, showing us that the rules we live by may not apply to the universe we inhabit. There are also ethical echoes. In computer science, the idea of processing infinite tasks appears in recursive algorithms or data streaming. Managing systems that can grow endlessly requires logic similar to Hilbert's: efficient, adaptive, capable of making room where none seems possible. And in debates about information overload, population growth, and resource limits, the illusion of infinite capacity can become dangerous. The Grand Hotel might work in mathematics, but in the real world, limits matter. So, What do we take from this paradox? First, that infinity is not an answer. It's a question. It unsettles our assumptions and invites humility. Second, that reality may be more flexible than it seems. What feels impossible can, under the right framework, become not only possible, but logical. And third, that the human mind has the courage to explore even what it cannot fully grasp. As you exit the hotel, the receptionist waves goodbye. "Come back anytime," he says. "We'll always find you a room." You look back, and for a moment, the impossible seems plausible. The infinite has made space for you. Fermi Paradox. You look up at the night sky, and for a moment you feel small. The stars stretch endlessly, points of light from suns trillions of miles away. You remember the numbers, hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy alone, and perhaps even more planets. If Earth is not unique, if life isn't a singular miracle, then the universe should be teeming with civilizations. And yet, there is only silence. No signals, no probes, no visits, nothing. Just an overwhelming quiet where there ought to be echoes of life. And then comes the question, a simple one, deceptively sharp. Where is everybody? This is the Fermi Paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly posed the question during a lunchtime conversation in 1950. It's a paradox born not of data, but of expectation. The logic is unsettlingly straightforward. Given the size and age of the universe, the emergence of intelligent life elsewhere should not only be possible, it should be inevitable. So, why haven't we seen any sign of it? To understand the paradox, we must start with scale. The Milky Way alone contains over 100 billion stars. A significant portion of them have planets in the habitable zone, regions where liquid water could exist. If just a tiny fraction of those planets develop life, and a smaller fraction evolve intelligence, and a smaller still master technology, there should be thousands, maybe millions of civilizations out there. Many of them would be far older than ours, millions or even billions of years more advanced. With that kind of head start, spreading through the galaxy should be easy, at least over cosmic timescales. Colonizing planets, sending signals, leaving artifacts. The galaxy should be alive with activity, but it isn't. Not that we've found. This is the core of the Fermi Paradox. The universe is statistically full, but observably empty. What could explain the silence? Some scientists propose that we are truly alone, a terrifying possibility. Maybe life itself is vanishingly rare. Perhaps the chain of events that led to conscious beings on Earth is so unlikely it has only happened once. This view, known as the rare Earth hypothesis, suggests we may be the only intelligent species in the galaxy. The silence is not mystery. It is evidence of isolation. Others argue that life is common, but intelligence is rare or fragile. Civilizations may rise only to self-destruct before they become spacefaring. Nuclear war, climate collapse, artificial intelligence gone awry. In this light, the silence becomes a graveyard, an echo of civilizations that never survived their adolescence. And then there are those who believe the silence is self-imposed. Perhaps advanced civilizations do not broadcast themselves. Maybe they fear others. This idea is captured in the dark forest hypothesis, where every civilization is a hunter and revealing your position is a fatal mistake. The universe becomes a forest of silence, each species hiding, listening, hoping to survive. Still others suggest we're just not looking properly. Our technology might be primitive. We may be listening on the wrong frequencies, using the wrong instruments. Or maybe intelligent life uses communication methods we don't yet understand. Gravitational waves, neutrino pulses, quantum entanglement. We could be missing the signal because we don't yet know what a signal is, Or perhaps they've already been here and left. Long before we emerged, alien civilizations may have risen and fallen, their ruins scattered across the stars, long forgotten. In this version of the paradox, we are latecomers to a party that ended billions of years ago. Each theory reveals something different, not just about the universe, but about us. The Fermi Paradox is ultimately a mirror. It forces us to confront our own fragility, our own assumptions, our own future. If civilizations destroy themselves, what does that say about our own trajectory? If others choose silence, are we being reckless in shouting our existence into the cosmos? And if we are truly alone, what kind of responsibility does that place on us? There are also ethical implications. Should we continue projects like SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence? Should we send messages out into space, hoping someone is listening? Or should we remain quiet, cautious of who might hear? History offers cautionary tales. Native cultures devastated by contact with more technologically advanced invaders. Can we be sure that those who find us will mean well? Or are we projecting human fears onto alien minds we cannot comprehend? Still, the silence may not last. The paradox may yet resolve in time. We may discover microbial life in the oceans of Europa. We may intercept a signal, faint but deliberate. Or perhaps we will become the answer ourselves. Humanity venturing into the stars, the first voice in a galaxy that has waited patiently for someone to speak. Barber Paradox. You walk into a small village nestled in the hills, known for its peculiar tradition. One single barber who serves the entire male population. The rule is simple and universally obeyed. The barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and only those men. At first, this strikes you as quaint, maybe even efficient. But as you settle into the rhythm of the village, an unsettling question begins to gnaw at you. Who shaves the barber? This is the Barber Paradox, first formulated by the British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell. What begins as a simple story of grooming etiquette quickly unfolds into one of the most fundamental challenges in logic and set theory. It is a paradox that doesn't merely raise a contradiction, it exposes the flaw in how we construct systems. Let's walk through the logic. The barber, by definition, shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. So, if a man shaves himself, the barber must not shave him. If a man does not shave himself, the barber must shave him. So far, so clear. But now we apply this definition to the barber himself. Does the barber shave himself? If he does, then by rule he cannot, because the barber only shaves men who do not shave themselves. If he does not, then he must, because the barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves. In both cases, we run into contradiction. He cannot shave himself, and he cannot not shave himself. Logic collapses. This paradox might sound like a playful mind game, but its implications are far-reaching. What Russell uncovered wasn't just a quirky village dilemma, it was a crisis in the foundations of mathematics. At the time, set theory, particularly naive set theory, was trying to define mathematics in terms of sets, collections of objects defined by a common rule. The Barber Paradox is a linguistic version of what became known as Russels Paradox in set theory. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then it should. It's the same contradiction. And it shook the mathematical world. Why? Because it showed that not all systems, even if logically consistent on the surface, are coherently definable. There are limits to how we can construct rules, especially self-referential ones. and without care, our most logical frameworks can implode under the weight of their own assumptions. Philosophically, the Barber Paradox is a warning about self-reference, when a system includes rules that refer back to themselves. Language, law, identity, and even artificial intelligence systems are often tangled in similar feedback loops. The more a system tries to define everything, including itself, the more it risks collapsing into paradox. In legal systems, this arises when laws are applied to themselves. Who enforces the enforcers? Who watches the watchers? In ethics, it appears in questions like, should tolerance tolerate intolerance? A loop we've already seen. In technology, recursive systems can result in infinite loops if not carefully constrained. The paradox also nudges us to confront something deeper: our desire for complete, flawless systems. We crave order. We want rules that govern everything, without exceptions. But the Barber Paradox says, no rule can govern everything, including itself, without risk. It tells us that every system must have limits, or at least a meta-level structure that isn't subject to the same rules. In formal logic, this insight led to entire revisions of how we think about mathematics, most notably type theory and axiomatic set theory, which create hierarchies to avoid such self-reference. But the lesson is not confined to mathematics. Think of organizations that try to regulate themselves without external oversight, or ideologies that aim to be universally true, but collapse when applied to their own foundations. The Barber Paradox becomes a mirror for authority, identity, and logic itself. Who am I if I define myself by what I am not? Who governs those who define governance? And yes, who shaves the barber? So, what do we take from this? First, that logic is not immune to contradiction. Rules, no matter how clean they seem, can backfire if they don't account for the system that enforces them. Second, that self-reference is a fragile loop. It requires layers, boundaries, or acknowledgement of its own instability. And third, that not every system can define itself without help. Sometimes we must step outside the frame to make sense of what's inside. The Barber Paradox doesn't offer a fix, it offers a revelation. Not every rule fits every case. Not every box can label itself. So the next time someone says, "There's a rule for everything," ask, "What about the rule maker?" And somewhere in that answer, you'll hear the quiet snip of a razor, still waiting for someone else to pick it up. Liar Paradox. You're handed a note. On it, in clean, deliberate handwriting, is a single sentence. This statement is false. You pause. If the statement is true, then what it says must hold. So it must be false. But if it's false, then what it says isn't the case. So it must be true. You read it again, slower this time. It doesn't matter how many times you go over it. You're trapped. The sentence loops in on itself like a snake swallowing its own tail. This is the Liar Paradox, one of the oldest and most mind-bending paradoxes in philosophy and logic. At first glance, it seems simple, even trivial, but the more you think about it, the more it shakes your faith in language, logic, and truth itself. The origins of the paradox stretch back to ancient Greece. The most famous version is attributed to the Cretan philosopher Epimenides, who supposedly said, "All Cretans are liars." If he, a Cretan, is telling the truth, then he must be lying. But if he's lying, then perhaps he's telling the truth. Round and round it goes, like an optical illusion of logic. The paradox lives in the heart of self-reference. A statement that talks about itself can easily slide into contradiction. In the case of the liar, the sentence refers to itself negatively. It declares its own falsehood. That single act of turning the sentence back onto itself breaks the rules. But why does this matter? Because logic, mathematics, and even language rely on the assumption that statements can be consistently true or false. This binary structure is the foundation of reasoning. We expect that a proposition is either correct or incorrect, not both. The liar paradox defies that. It lives in the forbidden space between yes and no, in the gray mist of contradiction. Philosophers and logicians have wrestled with this for centuries. Some have tried to ban self-reference, creating systems where a sentence cannot refer to itself. Others have introduced truth-value gaps, categories beyond true or false, such as undefined. Still others have proposed multi-valued logics, where a statement can be partly true, partly false. But no solution is entirely satisfying. The liar paradox has a way of sneaking through the cracks. It pops up in new forms, in computer science, in epistemology, in artificial intelligence. Every time we try to create a complete, consistent system, the liar whispers from the margins. What if the system speaks of itself? This was no longer just a philosophical annoyance by the 20th century. In 1931, mathematician Kurt Gödel dropped a bombshell on the foundations of mathematics. His incompleteness theorems used a form of the liar paradox to show that no sufficiently powerful mathematical system can be both complete and consistent. In other words, any system capable of expressing basic arithmetic will contain true statements that it cannot prove, and trying to prove everything would lead to contradictions. Gödel encoded a version of the liar paradox within numbers themselves. He constructed a mathematical sentence that essentially said, "This statement cannot be proven." If it could be proven, the system would prove something false. But if it can't be proven, then it's true, and yet unprovable. Logic broke under its own weight. The liar paradox didn't just shake logic, it redefined it. Outside of mathematics, the paradox also forces us to confront the limits of trust, truth, and communication. In a world where statements can refer to themselves, where systems judge themselves, we are left with a disturbing question. Can truth ever be fully self-contained? In media, we see forms of the liar paradox when fake news calls real news fake, or when disinformation campaigns accuse truth-tellers of lying. In politics, circular accusations and reflexive justifications create logic loops that make clarity impossible. In philosophy, radical skepticism can become its own trap. If you doubt everything, must you also doubt your own doubt? The liar paradox teaches us that language can betray us. It shows that meaning is fragile. That certainty, when turned inward, can collapse. So what are we to do? Some suggest we live with the paradox, that we accept that truth is not always tidy, and that some systems will always include exceptions, anomalies, and contradictions. Others propose more careful systems, ones with strict hierarchies, where statements can only talk about lower-level statements, not themselves. But the paradox resists control. Its power is in its simplicity. Just one sentence, 8 words, and the entire machinery of logic grinds to a halt. So what does the liar paradox ultimately reveal? First, that truth is more delicate than we think. Second, that systems need boundaries, or else they risk self-destruction. And third, that even our most powerful tools, language, logic, mathematics, can contain seeds of their own undoing. The next time someone says, "This statement is false," don't just laugh it off. Don't dismiss it as a word game, because sometimes a sing. Zeno's Paradox. You're standing at the edge of a racetrack watching a tortoise and a man prepare to race. But this is no ordinary race. The man, swift and confident, gives the tortoise a generous head start. The crowd chuckles, knowing the man will catch up quickly. The race begins. The tortoise crawls forward. The man takes off in pursuit, but Zeno leans over and whispers, "He'll never catch the tortoise." You blink, unsure if you heard correctly. "Of course he will," you say. "He's faster." But Zeno just smiles. By the time the man reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise will have moved forward, and when the man reaches that new point, the tortoise will have moved again. This will go on forever. He may get closer, but he'll never pass. This is Zeno's paradox, first proposed in the 5th century BCE by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea. It isn't just a riddle. It's a direct assault on our understanding of motion, space, and time. On the surface, it's absurd. In practice, it's profound. Let's walk through it. Suppose the tortoise starts 100 meters ahead. The man runs 10 times faster. By the time he reaches the 100-meter mark, the tortoise has moved 10 more meters. The man closes that gap, but the tortoise has moved again, this time just 1 meter, then 0.1 meters, then 0.01. Each time the man reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has gone a bit further. The distance gets smaller, but it never disappears. If the man must complete infinitely many tasks, each catching up to where the tortoise was, how can he ever finish? How can motion even occur if every path is infinitely divisible? Zeno constructed this and other paradoxes to challenge the mathematics and metaphysics of his day. His goal was to defend Parmenides, who claimed that all motion and change are illusions. Zeno's paradoxes, particularly this one, were designed to show that believing in motion leads to contradictions. But something strange happens. The logic feels sound. It plays by the rules. And that's what makes the paradox so unnerving. It shows how intuition and logic can be at war. For centuries, no one could fully resolve it. Aristotle tried, arguing that time and space are not composed of indivisible nows or points, but are continuous. Later, thinkers suggested that the paradox was linguistic, a trick of dividing processes into static snapshots. But the problem lingered, quietly undermining confidence in motion itself. Then came calculus. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz independently developed mathematical tools to handle change and motion. Using limits and infinite series, calculus showed that an infinite number of steps can sum to a finite result. The man could pass the tortoise after all. Mathematically, the distances form a converging series. 100 plus 10 plus 1 plus 0.1 plus converges to a finite value. The paradox, many claimed, was finally solved. But the discomfort didn't go away. Zeno had struck deeper than mere distance. He revealed something fragile in the way we conceptualize time. The fact that space and time can be endlessly divided, that motion requires crossing an infinite number of points, still unsettles us. It suggests that even the simplest action, like walking across a room, involves a complex dance with infinity. In modern physics, Zeno's ghost still lingers. Quantum Zeno effect, for instance, is a real phenomenon where frequent observation of a quantum system can prevent it from evolving, freezing it in place. In this sense, watching a system too closely may actually stop its motion. The paradox, once metaphorical, becomes literal. There's also a psychological dimension. The idea of never arriving, of always having just a little more to do, resonates with modern life. Endless to-do lists, unreachable goals, the treadmill of productivity. It can feel like we are all chasing tortoises, always approaching, never arriving. Zeno's logic captures the quiet despair of infinite progress with no completion. Philosophically, the paradox forces us to question the continuity of the universe. Is space truly smooth and continuous, or is it composed of discrete chunks? Are time and motion illusions of perception? Are we, like frames in a film, experiencing the illusion of motion in a series of frozen moments. So, what can we learn from this ancient race? First, that motion is not as simple as it seems. Beneath every step lies an infinite regress of smaller movements, each demanding explanation. Second, that infinity is not merely a number. It is a concept that rewires how we think about the finite. And third, that paradoxes don't just exist to be solved. They exist to expose the cracks in our understanding, the limits of our models. Zeno's paradox doesn't tell us that motion is impossible. It tells us that understanding motion requires more than watching someone run. It demands we look at what happens between the steps, into the invisible, infinitesimal spaces we usually ignore. So next time you take a step, Raven Paradox. Can observing a green apple really tell us something about black ravens? You're walking through a quiet orchard, notebook in hand, on a mission to observe and confirm the claim, all ravens are black. It's a simple hypothesis. You expect to find black ravens, and each one you see supports the idea. Then, just as you're about to write down another entry, your gaze shifts to the tree beside you. There, hanging from a branch, is a bright green apple. You stop. According to a strange twist of logic, what you've just witnessed, a green apple, is evidence that all ravens are black. Wait, what? This is the Raven Paradox, a subtle yet profound problem in the philosophy of science and logic first introduced by Carl Hempel in the 1940s. It challenges the very nature of confirmation and how we use evidence to support universal statements. At its heart is a simple, logical equivalence. The statement, "all ravens are black," is logically identical to "all non-black things are not ravens." In formal logic, they mean the same thing. If you accept that, then observing any non-black object that is not a raven, like a green apple, technically confirms the original statement. After all, it fits the rule. A non-black thing that isn't a raven. That's one more data point supporting your theory, and yet, it feels wrong. Intuitively, we expect that to confirm all ravens are black, we should be looking at ravens. We imagine ornithologists with binoculars trekking through forests, observing actual birds. The idea that studying fruit at a market or books in a library could provide useful data about raven coloration seems absurd, but the logic says otherwise. That gap between what logic demands and what intuition feels is the beating heart of the paradox. Let's break down the structure. 1. Suppose we accept the principle of confirmation by instances, that a universal claim, all x are y, is supported by observing particular examples, some x's that are y's. 2. All ravens are black is logically equivalent to all non-black things are non-ravens. 3. Therefore, observing a green apple, a non-black non-raven, should count as supporting the claim. But this leads to absurd implications. If every non-black non-raven confirms the hypothesis, then the world is overflowing with supporting evidence. Red cars, blue fish, white walls, they all count. Suddenly, almost everything becomes evidence for a claim about raven color. The notion of confirmation becomes too loose to be useful. Philosophers and scientists alike have wrestled with this. Some say the paradox reveals a flaw in how we treat equivalence in everyday reasoning. Logical identity doesn't always translate into practical or empirical significance. Others suggest it's a problem of relevance. Only certain kinds of observations genuinely bear on the truth of a hypothesis, regardless of logical form. Another approach uses Bayesian probability. In Bayesian terms, the degree to which an observation confirms a hypothesis depends on how surprising or informative it is. A black raven provides a bigger update to our beliefs than a green apple, because it's more relevant. While the apple may technically support the theory, it does so in such a minuscule way that it's essentially negligible. This subtle shift moves us away from binary logic toward degrees of confirmation, better reflecting how science actually works. In real scientific practice, we prioritize observations that are direct, relevant, and informative, not just logically consistent. Still, the Raven Paradox leaves a residue of discomfort. It reminds us that our models of reasoning, no matter how precise, can lead to absurd or counterintuitive conclusions. It also challenges the way we treat universal claims. When we say all X are Y, what kind of evidence are we really asking for? How many observations are enough? And what counts as relevant? There's also a deeper metaphor here. In a world saturated with information, not all data is equally meaningful. If everything confirms a theory, the theory might be too broad to be falsifiable. The Raven Paradox isn't just about birds. It's about epistemic humility, about recognizing that truth is not merely about stacking up observations, but about discerning which ones truly matter. So what does the Raven Paradox teach us? First, logical equivalence and practical reasoning aren't always aligned. Just because two statements are formally identical doesn't mean they're equally useful. Second, not all confirmation is created equal. Relevance matters, specificity matters. And third, reasoning in the real world requires judgment, not just formal rules. The next time you hear a sweeping claim, all of X are Y, ask not just how many examples exist, but which ones truly count. Because in a world full of apples, you might forget what you were trying to learn about ravens. Banach Tarski Paradox. You're holding a solid ball in your hands, smooth, simple, unbroken, a perfect sphere. Now imagine this. With the right mathematical precision, you could cut this ball into 5 pieces, and then, without stretching or adding any new material, you could reassemble those pieces into 2 identical spheres, each the same size as the original. No shrinking, no compression, just duplication. From nothing. You stare at the ball, struggling to imagine how such a thing could be possible. But in mathematics, it is. This is the Banach-Tarski Paradox, and it breaks the very idea of volume, logic, and reality itself. Proposed in 1924 by Polish mathematicians Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, the paradox is not an illusion or a trick. It's a proven result in set theoretic geometry. According to standard mathematical rules, specifically under the axiom of choice, it is possible to take a solid 3-dimensional ball, divide it into a finite number of non-overlapping parts, and reassemble those parts using only rotation and translation to create 2 balls of exactly the same size as the original. It sounds like sorcery, but it's mathematics. To understand the paradox, we need to leave behind the familiar world of physical objects and enter the abstract universe of pure mathematics. In that world, objects can be divided not into neat, measurable pieces, but into infinitely detailed, non-measurable sets, collections so fractured and abstract that volume no longer applies. The 5 pieces of the ball in Banach-Tarski are not chunks like slices of cake. They are constructed through complex transformations using the group properties of rotations in 3 dimensions. These pieces are so thoroughly scattered that they defy conventional measurement. And because of that, when they are rearranged, they bypass the usual conservation laws. They simply recreate the original volume, twice. Here's the key enabler. The axiom of choice. In set theory, this axiom states that given any collection of non-empty sets, it's possible to choose exactly one element from each, even if the collection is infinite. It's a powerful and controversial assumption. The Banach-Tarski Paradox is a direct consequence of this axiom. Without it, the paradox collapses. With it, mathematical reality becomes unrecognizable. But what does this mean for the real world? Can we really duplicate a ball by cutting it into bizarre mathematical shards? The answer is no. The paradox is purely theoretical. It depends on objects that can be divided with infinite precision, far beyond what atoms or molecules allow. In the physical world, such a process is impossible. Matter is made of indivisible units. The paradox lives in the space between math and material, between ideal and actual. Still, its implications are staggering. The Banach-Tarski Paradox challenges our assumptions about volume, conservation, and reality. We are taught that matter can't be created or destroyed, that if you split something, the parts must add up to the whole. But here, in the realm of abstract geometry, those rules dissolve, and what's left is a deeper, unsettling truth. Even the most intuitive concepts, like space, shape, and size, depend on the foundations we choose. Philosophically, the paradox touches on Platonism versus formalism in mathematics. Are mathematical objects real, existing in a perfect abstract world? Or are they symbolic tools we've created to model experience? The Banach-Tarski Paradox seems to support the former. In that Platonic universe, logic follows its own strange, consistent rules, even if they contradict physical sense. But if you're a formalist, this paradox is a wake-up call. It reminds you that mathematical rules are only as sound as the assumptions beneath them. Change the axiom, change the outcome. Reality, in math, is a matter of principle. The paradox also echoes in digital culture. In computer graphics, objects are modeled using sets, transformations, and abstract shapes. While no one's duplicating spheres from nothing, the idea of manipulating objects beyond physical constraints is routine. And in data science, where models generate results that feel real, the Banach-Tarski logic haunts the background. How much of what we see is constructed by systems built on assumptions we barely understand? So, what does the Banach-Tarski Paradox teach us? First, mathematics is not always intuitive. Just because something feels impossible doesn't mean it's false in the abstract. Second, assumptions matter. The entire paradox depends on one axiom. With it, volume can double. Without it, reality holds firm. Third, there's a difference between theoretical truth and physical possibility. Math can describe worlds stranger than anything nature provides. In the end, the Banach-Tarski Paradox is not about breaking the universe. It's about showing that our logic has boundaries, and those boundaries aren't always where we think they are. It reminds us that beneath the SMO, simulation, paradox. You're sitting in a quiet room, sipping coffee, watching sunlight filter through the blinds. Everything feels real. The warmth of the mug, the hum of distant traffic, the slow rhythm of your own thoughts. But then, a question creeps in, slow and insistent. What if none of this is real? What if you are not a person in a world, but a string of data in a highly advanced simulation? What if every moment, every memory, every sense of self is just the output of a code written by someone or something else? This is the simulation paradox. It's not merely a science fiction trope or a philosophical musing. It's a genuine, mathematically grounded argument proposed most famously by philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003. The idea is unsettlingly simple. If advanced civilizations can simulate conscious beings, and if they have any interest in doing so, then the number of simulated realities would far exceed the number of base or original realities. Statistically, it becomes more probable that you are one of the many simulations rather than a member of the base reality. Let's walk through the structure. The argument begins with 3 propositions, one of which must be true. First, almost no civilizations reach a level of technological advancement capable of creating such simulations. Second, civilizations that do reach this level lose interest in simulating minds. Third, we are almost certainly living in a simulation. It's that third possibility that twists logic into paradox. If simulations are easy to create and numerous, then being in one is the most likely scenario. Your world, your choices, your consciousness, none of it may be what it seems. You might be nothing more than an elaborate character running inside a post-human video game. At first, the idea sounds absurd, but it draws its strength not from science fiction, but from cold, probabilistic reasoning. If a single civilization could simulate 1 billion conscious beings, and if multiple civilizations reach that capability, then the number of simulated minds vastly outweighs the number of biological ones. And if you pick a conscious observer at random from the universe, odds are you've picked a simulation. But here, the paradox deepens. If we are in a simulation, how could we know? And if we can't know, does it matter? Physicists and philosophers have proposed various tests for simulated reality: anomalies in physical constants, computational limits, digital artifacts. Some suggest that the speed of light or quantum uncertainty might be indicators of rendering limitations. Others point to déjà vu, glitches in perception, or the strangely mathematical elegance of the universe itself. But all of these are speculative. There is, as yet, no definitive method to step outside the code. And yet, even without evidence, the simulation paradox poses an epistemological dilemma. If your experiences can be fully simulated, then experience alone cannot be trusted as proof of reality. This undermines centuries of philosophical reliance on sense data. It's Descartes' evil demon in digital form, not deceiving you with illusion, but with impeccably rendered imitation. The paradox also invites ethical questions. If simulations are possible, and we are in one, then who is running it? Are they benevolent creators, indifferent observers, sadistic players? And what is our purpose? Are we experiments, entertainment, or echoes? Moreover, what ethical obligations do we ourselves have if we ever create simulations containing conscious minds? This problem collapses the boundary between philosophy and physics, between metaphysics and math. It destabilizes the ground beneath our feet. But perhaps the real terror of the simulation paradox is not that it might be true, but that it might be unfalsifiable. If a simulation is perfect, we could never prove or disprove our condition. We are trapped in a loop of doubt, where reality becomes a hypothesis that cannot be tested. Still, the paradox has its critics. Some argue that consciousness might not be computable. Others point out that we've never seen evidence of such simulations, or that future civilizations might lose interest in them entirely. But these objections don't resolve the core issue. They merely challenge the assumptions. So what does the simulation paradox teach us? First, it reveals the fragility of what we call reality. Our trust in experience is a leap of faith, one we make every time we open our eyes. Second, it humbles our sense of certainty. We are not the objective observers we imagine ourselves to be. We might be constructs, nested within constructs. Third, it forces us to re-examine what matters. If everything is simulated, then meaning isn't given, it's made. Purpose isn't programmed, it's chosen. Because paradoxically, even in a simulation, your actions have weight. In the end, the simulation paradox doesn't just ask whether the world is real, it asks whether you are real enough to matter, even if the world isn't. Preface. Paradox, you've just finished writing a book. Pages filled with research, arguments, and careful reasoning. You've checked every source, revised every chapter, and defended each claim with conviction. Yet, as you write the preface, you pause. You include a short note. Despite my best efforts, it is possible that errors remain. It's a gesture of humility, a standard disclaimer. But then you realize something unsettling. If you truly believe that at least one claim in the book might be wrong, how can you still believe that each claim is right? You've just affirmed a contradiction. And with that, you've stepped into the Preface Paradox. This paradox, first articulated by philosopher David Mackinson in 1965, arises from a clash between two seemingly reasonable beliefs: that each individual statement in your book is true, and that the collection as a whole is likely to contain at least one falsehood. It forces us to confront the limits of rational belief, the nature of fallibility, and what it means to trust our own knowledge. Let's break it down. As the author, you've gone through your manuscript line by line. Each assertion about history, science, logic, or interpretation you believe to be true. You wouldn't have included it otherwise. If someone asked, "Do you stand by chapter 4?" you'd say yes. And chapter 7? Yes, again. Yet, you also know that in any lengthy, complex work, mistakes are likely. Maybe a citation is outdated. Maybe a subtle error slipped past your attention. So you believe that at least one claim in the book is false. But believing both that each statement is true and that some statement is false leads to a contradiction. This isn't just a writer's dilemma. The Preface Paradox strikes at the heart of how we hold beliefs. We trust the content of our thoughts, yet acknowledge that our thinking is fallible. We believe each piece of information we accept, but we also believe that somewhere among our beliefs, we've probably gone wrong. These two commitments, the specific and the general, are at odds. Some might argue that this is just a psychological quirk, not a true logical paradox. After all, humans aren't machines, but the problem isn't about emotion or uncertainty. It's about epistemic consistency. In formal terms, if you believe proposition A and B and C and so on, then logically you should believe the conjunction of all those, A and B and C. Yet, you also believe not A and B and C. That's a contradiction. How do philosophers try to resolve this? Some suggest modifying our concept of belief. Perhaps we shouldn't treat belief as absolute, but as graded, degrees of confidence, not binary acceptance. Others propose weakening the logical closure of belief. Maybe you can believe each part of a set without being committed to believing the set as a whole. Still, others argue that rational agents should accept some inconsistency, as long as the inconsistency doesn't prevent practical action. But each solution comes with costs. If belief is no longer binary, can we still use it to make firm decisions? If we abandon logical closure, are we undermining the coherence of rational thought? And if we accept contradiction, how do we avoid sliding into full-blown irrationality? The paradox appears outside philosophy too. In journalism, an editor might approve each article for publication, confident in its accuracy, while also believing that across a daily newspaper, some errors will inevitably appear. In science, a researcher believes each of their reported findings, yet expects that future work will correct or revise at least some of them. In everyday life, we trust our memories and perceptions, yet we also believe that we're sometimes mistaken. We live the Preface Paradox every day, often without noticing it. The paradox doesn't suggest that we should abandon our beliefs or lose faith in our conclusions. Rather, it invites a deeper awareness of our epistemic humility. We are finite beings, working within imperfect systems, always susceptible to error. Yet we must still act, write, speak, decide, believing each step is right, even as we acknowledge that some steps might falter. So what does the Preface Paradox teach us? First, belief is not a fortress. It is a network, and within that network, tension can, and often does, exist. Second, certainty is not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to act responsibly in the face of it. Third, intellectual honesty includes recognizing that the things we are most sure of may, in time, be shown to be incomplete or mistaken. The Preface Paradox doesn't ask us to resolve the contradiction. It asks us to live within it, with awareness, with care, and with the courage to revise. It reminds us that knowledge is always a draft, and that even our most carefully written truths might one day need editing. So the next time you say, "I believe this," and also whisper, "But I might be wrong," know that you are not being weak. You are being wise. Brudan Ass Paradox. A donkey stands precisely equidistant between two identical piles of hay. Both are equally fresh, equally large, and equally appealing. The donkey is hungry, desperately so, but it cannot choose between them. It looks left, it looks right. There is no reason to favor one over the other. Paralyzed by the perfect symmetry of the situation, it hesitates, it waits, and eventually, it starves. This is the essence of Brudan Ass Paradox, a simple story with profound philosophical implications. Named after the 14th century French philosopher Jean Buridan, though the story likely postdates him, the paradox asks, can a perfectly rational agent, when faced with two identical options and no reason to choose one over the other, ever make a decision? And if not, what does that say about the power and the limits of rationality? At first, it seems like a cautionary tale about indecision, but the problem digs deeper. The donkey doesn't fail to choose because it's lazy or unaware. It fails because, as a creature of pure logic and perfect reasoning, it cannot justify preferring one option over the other. Without any differentiating factor, even the act of choice becomes impossible. The paradox pushes us to confront a troubling idea, that perfect rationality might not lead to action, but to paralysis. Let's explore the structure. Suppose an agent bases all decisions on reasons. If two options are identical in every way, and no external force intervenes, then the agent has no grounds to choose either. But life often requires action, even when reasons are insufficient or absent. If choice is suspended until justification arrives, then in symmetrical situations, action may never come. The agent stalls, not because it is irrational, but because it is too rational. This leads to uncomfortable questions. Is choice always about reasons? Or is there a role for spontaneity, randomness, or will? The paradox suggests that pure logic may be insufficient for survival, that if we were guided solely by reason, we might fail in situations that demand decisiveness without justification. Some have proposed ways around this. One is to introduce a randomizing mechanism, like a coin flip, into the agent's decision process. If there's no reason to pick one pile over the other, then perhaps randomness is rational. Others argue that in real life, no two options are ever truly identical. There are always micro differences. One pile is ever so slightly closer, or one smells just a bit stronger. But while these may solve the problem in practice, they dodge the philosophical heart of the paradox. What happens when reason fails to decide? The implications extend far beyond donkeys and hay. In ethics, Brudan Ass challenges utilitarianism, which bases moral choice on calculated outcomes. If two actions produce equal utility, which is the better choice? The theory stalls. In artificial intelligence, the paradox raises concerns about autonomous agents. If we design machines to act solely on reason, will they freeze in symmetrical dilemmas? Must we program them with a bias for action? Politically, the paradox shows up in decision paralysis. A leader faces two equally risky policies. Both offer potential benefits and both carry costs. With no clear advantage, the leader hesitates, delaying action while consequences mount. The lesson is stark. Indecision can be more dangerous than a flawed decision. The paradox also confronts us with the limitations of human introspection. Have you ever found yourself unable to choose between two equally appealing paths? Two job offers? Two cities? Two futures? You weigh the pros and cons endlessly, looking for the right answer. But what if there is no right answer? Only the need to choose. In those moments, we meet the paradox in our own minds. So how do we live with Brudan Ass? Some philosophers suggest embracing the irrational as a necessary part of decision-making. Not irrationality as foolishness, but as the courage to act without perfect justification. Others propose that preference can emerge from internal states, moods, intuitions, even unconscious leanings. Perhaps these, too, are part of what it means to be rational, broader than numbers, deeper than symmetry. What does this paradox teach us? First, perfect rationality, when isolated, can be paralyzing. It needs help, context, impulse, or a gentle push. Second, action is often required even in the absence of certainty, and sometimes the act of choosing is more important than the choice itself. Third, we must make peace with decisions that have no clear answer. Life will not always give us reasons, but it will always demand responses. Brudan Ass isn't just a fable about a stubborn animal. It's a mirror held up to our ideal of logic and reason. It asks, what will you do when reason gives you nothing? And perhaps the answer is this: you choose anyway. Because not choosing is a choice too. Lottery Paradox. You're holding a ticket for a massive lottery. Millions of tickets sold, only one will win. You glance at your number, then at the odds. Rationally, you're sure you will not win. You say it aloud, confidently. You look at your friend's ticket. Same odds, same conclusion. One by one, you examine hundreds of tickets. For each, it is perfectly reasonable to believe it will lose. And yet, you know one must win. How can you believe each ticket will lose, and also believe that one of them will win? You've stepped into the lottery paradox. First formulated by philosopher Henry E. Keiberg Jr. in 1961, the lottery paradox exposes a deep conflict between rational belief, probability, and logic. It shows that if we accept a series of individually reasonable beliefs, we may be forced into a collectively irrational position. The paradox asks, if it's reasonable to believe of each individual ticket that it won't win, how can it be reasonable to believe that one will? Let's unpack the structure. You're presented with a lottery of, say, 1 million tickets. Only one ticket will win. For each ticket, the probability that it loses is extremely high, 999,999 out of 1,000,000. So, for each individual ticket, it seems entirely rational to believe it is a loser. If we accept a principle called rational acceptance, which says we may reasonably believe high probability statements, then you're justified in believing each ticket will lose. But from this, you end up believing something contradictory, that no ticket will win. And that contradicts a known truth. Exactly one ticket must win. This isn't just a logical curiosity. It cuts to the heart of how we form beliefs, especially in uncertain situations. It challenges the relationship between individual rational beliefs and collective coherence. How can all your beliefs be individually justified, yet together lead to a contradiction? Some responses suggest giving up on closure under conjunction, the idea that if you believe A, and you believe B, you must also believe A and B. In the lottery paradox, that rule fails. Others propose that beliefs based on probability should not count as full beliefs at all. Perhaps they're just credences, degrees of belief rather than binary acceptance. But these solutions have consequences. If we can't treat high probability beliefs as true enough to act on, how do we make decisions in everyday life? The paradox doesn't just haunt philosophy, it shadows politics, law, science. Take a courtroom. Jurors must determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But what if statistical evidence shows a 99.9% chance of guilt? Is that enough? We hesitate, because even though it seems reasonable to believe guilt in one case, we know that if we accepted such reasoning across the board, some innocence would be punished. The lottery paradox explains this discomfort. Each individual judgment might be reasonable, but the collective practice is flawed. Or consider medicine. You believe a patient has a low chance of having a rare disease. You think it's reasonable to treat them as healthy. But what if every doctor reasons this way and a real case slips through? The paradox shows how treating probability as truth can lead to systemic failure. Then there's artificial intelligence. An algorithm might predict outcomes with high confidence. Should it act on those predictions as though they were facts? The lottery paradox says, be careful. Acting on many small certainties can lead to one big contradiction. Philosophically, the paradox raises uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to believe something? Is belief binary, true or false or scalar, shades of confidence? Are we justified in believing things just because they're highly probable? And if we are, how do we avoid believing a contradiction? Some suggest we abandon the notion that belief must always be consistent. After all, human reasoning often tolerates inconsistencies. But this view risks undermining the very purpose of belief, to guide coherent action and understanding. Others argue for probabilistic logic, where beliefs aren't strictly true or false, but weighted. Still, this changes the meaning of belief itself. So what does the lottery paradox teach us? First, rationality isn't always consistent. What seems reasonable in isolation can collapse under accumulation. Second, belief is fragile. The tools we use to build knowledge, probability, evidence, reason, can lead us astray when combined carelessly. Third, uncertainty demands humility. Even our most confident judgments might rest on a foundation of contradiction. The lottery paradox doesn't tell us to stop trusting probability. It asks us to be wary of turning likelihood into certainty. It reminds us that truth is more than numbers. It's coherence, context, and care. So next time you're sure something won't happen, ask yourself, how many others are just as sure? And what if, in that crowd of certainty, something improbable still must come true? Twin Paradox. You and your twin stand side by side beneath a starlit sky. You are identical in every way. Same age, same body, same memories. But then, one of you steps into a spaceship. With a wave and a smile, your twin blasts off into the cosmos at near light speed. Years pass. You go about your life on Earth. Slow, steady, grounded. Then, one day, the ship returns. Your twin emerges from the capsule, youthful and unchanged. But you, still standing in the same field, are now visibly older. How can this be? How can two people who began as equals now live in mismatched time? Welcome to the Twin Paradox, one of the strangest consequences of Einstein's theory of relativity. Despite the name, it's not a true contradiction, but it is a puzzle so counterintuitive, so psychologically jarring, that for decades it has haunted classrooms, scientific debates, and philosophical discussions alike. The paradox forces us to rethink time itself, not as a fixed backdrop to our lives, but as something fluid, elastic, and deeply dependent on motion. Let's explore the structure. According to Einstein's special relativity, time dilates as you approach the speed of light. That means the faster you move through space, the slower you move through time. For the traveling twin, zooming through the galaxy at incredible speeds, time slows down relative to someone stationary on Earth. From the Earth-bound twins' perspective, their siblings' clock ticks more slowly. But here comes the paradox. From the point of view of the twin on the ship, isn't the Earth moving instead? Shouldn't time slow for the one who stays behind? This symmetry seems to imply that each twin should see the other as aging more slowly. But when they reunite, only one has aged less. How can both think the other is younger, yet one clearly is? The resolution lies in the asymmetry of acceleration. The traveling twin must turn around and return, undergoing changes in velocity that break the symmetry. Special relativity applies to inertial non-accelerating frames, and acceleration introduces complexity. The Earth twin remains in a consistent frame. The traveler does not. That's why their experiences of time diverge. Still, even knowing this doesn't dull the dissonance. Time, we like to believe, is universal. It marches forward, steady and fair. But relativity tells us otherwise. Time is relative to motion. There is no single objective now that spans the universe. Every observer carries their own timeline, shaped by their speed through space. The twin paradox puts this in human terms. It doesn't just bend time, it bends our sense of identity, continuity, and fairness. Philosophically, the paradox challenges our understanding of simultaneity, cause and effect, and even mortality. If time passes differently depending on how you move, then questions arise. Can we outrun death by speeding up? Can future civilizations manipulate time by manipulating velocity? Can two people share a life if they experience time at different rates? In science fiction, the twin paradox is often romanticized. Lovers separated by time, astronauts returning to find their world changed, but its real-world implications are already visible. High-precision satellites, like those in the GPS system, must account for time dilation effects. Without correcting for relativity, your phone's location could be miles off. Even though we aren't near light speed, the principle holds. Motion alters time, and yet, beneath the equations and spacecraft lies a deeper message. The twin paradox shows that truth isn't always intuitive. Our minds evolved for walking speed, not for relativistic thought. What feels absurd might be real. What seems certain, like the ticking of a clock, may not be fixed at all. So, what does the twin paradox teach us? First, time is not absolute. It's a variable, a fabric stretched and squeezed by motion. Second, reality depends on perspective. What you experience depends on where you are and how you move. Third, even the most intimate things, like age, memory, and connection, are subject to forces far beyond our senses. The paradox doesn't accuse relativity of contradiction. Instead, it reveals the limits of human intuition. It shows how the universe often whispers truths we're not built to hear, until we stop trusting what feels natural and start trusting what we can prove. So, the next time someone tells you that time flies, remember, it really does, but not for everyone, and not always in the same direction. Because in the universe of relativity, even twins can grow apart, not by distance, but by time itself. Simpson's Paradox. You're reviewing data from a hospital. 2 treatments for a disease have been tested. Looking at the results, treatment A appears more successful than treatment B. It's clear. The numbers speak for themselves, but then you look deeper, dividing the data by age groups or severity of illness, and suddenly the pattern flips. In every subgroup, treatment B outperforms treatment A, yet in the total data, it's the opposite. How can a treatment be better in every category, but worse overall? You feel reality bending beneath your logic. This is not just a statistical fluke, it's a paradox. Simpson's Paradox, first described by Edward H. Simpson in 1951, is one of the most astonishing and unsettling phenomena in statistics. It reveals how trends that appear in several separate groups can reverse when the groups are combined. In other words, what seems true in parts may not be true in the whole, and vice versa. The paradox doesn't arise from faulty math, but from the structure of the data itself, specifically from hidden variables and how they interact with groupings. Let's break it down. Suppose we're comparing two treatments across two hospitals. In Hospital X, treatment A succeeds 90% of the time, and treatment B 85%. In Hospital Y, treatment A succeeds 60% of the time, and treatment B 55%. So, in both hospitals, A looks better. But now suppose Hospital X treated mostly mild cases and Hospital Y mostly severe ones. And suppose treatment B was more often used in the tougher cases. When you pool the data, the larger number of severe cases in the B group drags down its overall success rate. Suddenly, A looks worse, even though B was actually outperforming A in both individual settings. This reversal is not a trick. It's a logical consequence of how data can be distributed. It challenges the assumption that more information leads to clearer understanding. In Simpson's Paradox, the more you aggregate, the more you risk misunderstanding. And that insight is not just about math. It's about how we interpret the world. Philosophically, the paradox forces us to rethink what we mean by truth. Is it true that treatment A is better, or that treatment B is? Both and neither. It depends on how you slice the data. This isn't relativism. It's the nature of context-dependent logic. Simpson's paradox shows that facts don't speak for themselves. They whisper in dialects shaped by structure, grouping, and framing. The implications ripple across disciplines. In medicine, a treatment may appear effective in one demographic, but harmful in another. In public policy, a program might show success in urban areas, failure in rural, averaging to an illusion of neutrality. In sports, a player might have a better batting average against each pitcher, yet a worse average overall. Even in machine learning, where algorithms make decisions based on vast data, the paradox lurks, ready to reverse conclusions when variables are improperly controlled. This makes Simpson's paradox not just a statistical curiosity, but a cognitive warning. It reminds us that the mind craves simple stories, but the truth often resists simplicity. When we ignore lurking variables or fail to stratify our analysis, we risk building conclusions on sand. It also raises ethical challenges. In legal trials, data presented without nuance can sway judgment. In marketing, selectively grouped statistics can be used to manipulate consumers. Politicians might trumpet improvements in one area while quietly averaging away declines elsewhere. Simpson's paradox gives cover to those who wish to obscure the truth behind numbers. So, what can we do? The first step is awareness. Recognize that data, like language, is structured, and that structure shapes meaning. The second is vigilance. Always ask, what are the categories? What's being grouped? Could something be hiding behind the numbers? And third, humility. Simpson's paradox shows that even with perfect data, interpretation can falter. The numbers may be objective, but our reading of them never is. What does this paradox teach us? First, aggregated truths can conceal specific realities. The big picture is not always clearer than the close-up. Second, context is everything. A conclusion that feels irrefutable might crumble when you look from another angle. Third, critical thinking must include statistical literacy. In a world awash with data, understanding paradoxes like this one is a form of intellectual self-defense. Simpson's paradox doesn't say you should distrust all statistics. It says you should never stop questioning what's behind them. Numbers can clarify, but they can also deceive. So the next time someone tells you the data is clear, ask them, clear for whom? Clear how? And what might that clarity be hiding? Because in the end, the paradox reminds us of a deeper truth. Not all lies are made of words. Some are shaped with numbers, hidden in the folds of averages, and told with silence. Russels Paradox. You walk into a library that prides itself on order. Every book is carefully cataloged. Some books list themselves in their own indexes. Self-referential, a little odd, but nothing illegal. Then you come across a curious catalog titled Index of All Indexes That Do Not List Themselves. You pause. A question forms. Should this index include itself? If it includes itself, then by its own definition, it shouldn't be included. But if it doesn't include itself, then by the very same rule, it should be listed. The logic loops in on itself, and your mind follows, spinning in paradox. This is Russell's Paradox, and it shattered the foundations of set theory when Bertrand Russell introduced it in 1901. It's not just a quirky logical riddle. It exposed a fault line beneath the entire structure of mathematics. At its core, the paradox deals with sets, collections of objects. Some sets are ordinary, like the set of apples in a basket. Others are stranger, like the set of all sets. In naive set theory, any definable collection qualifies as a set. Russell asked a simple question. What about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? Let's call it R. Does R contain itself? If R does contain itself, then by its own definition, only sets that do not contain themselves, it should not contain itself. But if R does not contain itself, then it does qualify for inclusion, and should contain itself. Either answer leads to contradiction. The very act of defining R breaks the system. This paradox devastated early efforts to formalize mathematics through set theory. In the late 19th century, thinkers like Gottlob Frege were building grand structures of logic, hoping to ground all of math in pure reason. Frege's masterpiece, Grundgesetze der Arithmetik, was nearly complete when Russell wrote to him with this paradox. Frege was devastated. He wrote in the margin of his book, "A scientist can hardly encounter anything more unfortunate than to have the foundation give way just as the work is finished." The impact was profound. If sets could be defined so freely that they created contradictions, then mathematics, long considered the realm of perfect certainty, was in trouble. To move forward, mathematicians had to rebuild set theory with stricter rules. The result was axiomatic set theory, particularly the Zermelo-Fraenkel system, ZF, which restricts how sets can be formed to avoid self-reference. Russell's paradox isn't isolated. It belongs to a family of self-referential problems, like the liar paradox. This sentence is false. Or the Barber Paradox. The barber shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. Each creates a logical loop, a contradiction born from self-application. These paradoxes show that language, logic, and systems are not immune to collapse when they turn inward. In philosophy, Russell's paradox challenges our faith in systems that try to contain everything, including themselves. It asks, can any system be complete and consistent? Can we define a total framework that accounts for all definitions, including its own? Decades later, Kurt Gödel would echo this question in his incompleteness theorems. proving that no consistent system of arithmetic can prove all truths about itself. Russels Paradox laid the groundwork for this philosophical earthquake. In the digital age, the paradox resurfaces in programming and databases. Circular references, stack overflows, and infinite recursion are real-world echoes of Russell's insight. Even artificial intelligence must grapple with self-reference. Can a system truly model itself? Can it simulate self-awareness without contradiction? Russell's Paradox also teaches a broader lesson about human knowledge. We strive to organize, define, and categorize. We build mental and institutional systems to map the world. But when those systems begin to include themselves, as in governments regulating governments or science studying the nature of science, we must tread carefully. The logic that builds can also entangle. So what does Russell's Paradox teach us? First, not everything definable is permissible. Just because a concept can be imagined doesn't mean it fits within a coherent system. Second, self-reference is powerful and dangerous. When systems speak about themselves, paradox often lurks nearby. Third, limits are necessary. To build stable foundations, we must sometimes accept that not all constructions are allowed. Russell's Paradox isn't about a contradiction in the world. It's about a contradiction in our thinking, about how we draw boundaries and what happens when those boundaries dissolve. It reminds us that even in the realm of logic, there are no shortcuts. Clarity demands constraint. So next time you try to define everything, to catalog the total, to write the final index, pause. Ask yourself, does this include itself? And what if, by trying to contain the whole, you've broken the very frame? Galileos Paradox. Imagine walking through an endless corridor of numbers. You begin to count 1, 2, 3, 4 onward without end. Then you start another list, this time of perfect squares, 1, 4, 9, 16, and so on. At first glance, it seems obvious. The set of all natural numbers must be larger than the set of their squares. After all, most numbers aren't perfect squares. The squares feel like a sparse subset, dots scattered across the infinite line of integers. But then, something strange happens. You start pairing them. 1 with 1, 2 with 4, 3 with 9, and so on. Suddenly, for every natural number, there's a square, and for every square, there's a natural number. The sets align perfectly, 1 to 1. How can a part be equal to the whole? This is Galileo's Paradox, introduced by the Italian scientist Galileo Galilei in the 17th century. It strikes at the very core of our understanding of quantity and infinity. And though it may seem like a harmless curiosity, it unsettled mathematical thought for centuries, forcing a redefinition of what it means to compare sizes and what we really mean when we say something is larger or smaller. Let's examine the structure. In finite sets, it's intuitive. If you remove elements from a set, it becomes smaller. 5 apples are fewer than 10, but infinity behaves differently. The set of natural numbers is infinite. The set of square numbers is also infinite, but appears less dense. Yet, we can form a bijective correspondence between them. Each natural number n pairs with its square n squared. This 1-to-1 mapping suggests that the two sets have the same size, or more precisely, the same cardinality. But how can a subset be equal in size to the set it comes from? Galileo's insight was that traditional ideas of greater and lesser don't apply to infinite sets. He wrote, "The attributes equal, greater, and less are not applicable to infinite quantities. For finite sets, we measure size by counting elements. For infinite ones, we must look at the possibility of 1-to-1 pairing. Infinity resists our everyday intuitions. It demands new tools." Later, in the 19th century, Mathematician Georg Cantor formalized these ideas. He defined cardinality as a way to compare the sizes of infinite sets. Two sets have the same cardinality if there exists a bijection between them. Under this logic, the set of natural numbers, even numbers, square numbers, and prime numbers all share the same cardinality. They are all countably infinite. But not all infinities are equal. Cantor showed that the set of real numbers, for example, is uncountably infinite. A larger infinity, one that cannot be paired one-to-one with the naturals. Infinity comes in layers. Still, Galileo's paradox lingers, not just as a mathematical insight, but as a philosophical one. It challenges our very notions of part and whole. In the world we live in, parts are always smaller than wholes. A chapter is less than a book. A day is less than a year. But in the realm of infinity, a part can be equal to the whole. The subset and the superset can share the same size. This collapse of hierarchy unsettles our mental scaffolding. Philosophically, the paradox invites us to question the limits of human intuition. We evolved in a finite world. Our senses and logic are built for counting sheep, not infinities. Yet the universe itself seems to speak the language of the infinite, in time, in space, in possibility. Galileo's paradox shows that logic alone is not enough. We must reshape our intuitions to match the strange terrain of abstract thought. It also echoes in other fields. In cosmology, questions about the size and shape of the universe mirror the paradox. Can a finite thing contain infinite space? In theology, the nature of the divine is often described in infinite terms. Omnipresence, eternity, boundlessness. What does it mean to speak of a being that contains all, yet is not more than its parts? Even in ethics, the paradox has implications. If all human lives are of equal worth, but the population is infinite, how do we value action? If doing good for one person in an infinite crowd doesn't change the total sum of well-being, does it still matter? The logic of infinity presses on our sense of meaning. So what does Galileo's paradox teach us? First, intuition is limited. What feels obvious in the finite world can collapse under infinity. Second, mathematics can outpace common sense, but not without cost. We must learn new languages to grasp new truths. Third, paradox is not failure, it is revelation. It shows where our concepts break and where deeper understanding must begin. Galileo's paradox doesn't demand resolution, it demands transformation. A rethinking of what numbers are, what sets mean, and how deeply we must change our minds to meet the infinite. So next time you think you know what bigger means, look again. In the realm of the infinite, even your smallest assumptions might not hold. Paradox of the Court. In ancient Athens, a promising young man named Euathlus approaches the great sophist Protagoras with a bold request. He wishes to be trained in the art of law. But there's a catch. Euathlus cannot pay up front. Instead, he proposes a deal. He will pay Protagoras only after he wins his first court case. The master agrees. Time passes. Euathlus completes his training. But strangely, he never takes on a case. He never steps into court. He never pays. Frustrated, Protagoras sues him to recover the fee. They meet in court. And suddenly, both men realize they are standing inside a paradox. Protagoras argues, "If I win this case, the court will order Euathlus to pay me, so I get my money. But if I lose, that means Euathlus has won his first case, and by the terms of our agreement, he must pay me. Either way, I win." Euathlus responds, "If I lose, the court has decided I must pay. But according to our deal, I only pay after winning. And if I win this case, then the court says I don't have to pay. Either way, I don't owe anything." Both sides make perfect sense, and yet both can't be right. This is the paradox of the court, and it's not just a quirky historical anecdote, it's a mirror reflecting the limits of legal logic, contractual agreements, and the fragile boundary between language and justice. It shows how seemingly clear rules can entangle themselves when placed in a feedback loop of conditional obligations. Let's unpack the structure. The contract is conditional. Payment follows a specific event, winning a court case. But now the condition and the legal process assessing it are folded into the same event. The case is both the trigger and the test. That's the core of the paradox, a self-referential loop where the outcome determines its own terms. If the court rules one way, the logic flips back on itself, unraveling any final judgment. This paradox isn't just rhetorical cleverness. It touches a nerve in legal theory, the problem of performative contradictions. When the system meant to resolve disputes becomes part of the dispute itself, impartiality dissolves. The judge must decide a case whose outcome invalidates or reinforces the very logic of the decision. The courtroom becomes a hall of mirrors. Real-world legal systems often try to avoid such traps through procedural safeguards, separating contract enforcement from interpretation, or rejecting circular clauses. But the deeper lesson remains. Justice depends not just on fairness of content, but clarity of structure. The paradox exposes how easily logic can turn inward, how truth and justice can conflict when rules are too clever for their own good. Philosophically, the paradox calls into question the idea that reason alone can resolve all disputes. It belongs to the broader family of self-referential paradoxes, like the liar paradox, "This sentence is false," or Russels Paradox, "The set of all sets that do not contain themselves." In each case, the act of making a statement folds back into itself and the logic implodes. Here, legal obligation becomes its own undoing. But the paradox of the court also raises deeper ethical issues. What happens when fairness and logic point in different directions? Protagoras deserves compensation for his labor, but Euthyphros acted within the bounds of their agreement. The legal contract may be flawed, but both men are morally right in their own way. So, how do we judge? Do we follow the spirit of the law or its letter? This tension is alive in modern courtrooms. Lawsuits are often won or lost not on facts, but on technicalities, clauses, exceptions, procedural quirks. The paradox reminds us that legal truth is not the same as moral truth, that justice is more than logic, and that sometimes our systems of resolution become the source of the conflict they're meant to solve. What does the paradox of the court teach us? First, contracts can collapse under their own logic. A clever clause is not always a fair one. Second, self-reference is dangerous in systems meant to be impartial. When the judge becomes part of the case, justice falters. Third, justice requires more than logic. It requires wisdom, flexibility, and the ability to see beyond the structure of rules. The paradox doesn't ask us to abandon legal thinking. It asks us to strengthen it by recognizing its limits. It invites us to design systems that avoid circular traps, that protect substance over form, and that honor not only the deal but the dignity behind it. So the next time someone says, "It's all in the contract," ask, what if the contract defeats itself? Because sometimes the real dispute is not about what was agreed, but about how we decide what agreement even means. Goodman's Paradox. You're standing in a clearing, looking at an emerald under the sunlight. It's green, as emeralds always are. You've seen hundreds, maybe thousands, and every single one has shared this brilliant hue. You conclude with confidence, all emeralds are green. But a philosopher approaches and says, what if they're not? What if every emerald you've seen so far is actually grue? You blink, grew? Grew, he explains, means green before the year 2100 and blue afterward. According to this new term, all the emeralds you've observed are both green and grew. But now, as 2100 approaches, you wonder, will the next emerald you observe still be green, or will it be blue? Welcome to Goodman's Paradox, also known as the Paradox of Grew. Introduced by philosopher Nelson Goodman in the mid-20th century, this paradox doesn't challenge what we know, it challenges how we know it. It turns the act of induction, the process of drawing general rules from specific examples, inside out, asking whether the principles we trust to predict the future are as stable as we think. In a world governed by patterns, Goodman asks, what makes one pattern normal and another absurd? Let's walk through the logic. In traditional induction, we observe a set of things, say green emeralds, and infer a universal rule. All emeralds are green. This is how science, common sense, and daily life operate. But Goodman introduces a twist. Imagine a predicate like grew. An object is grew if it is observed before 2100 and is green, or if it is observed after 2100 and is blue. By this definition, all emeralds observed up to now are both green and grew. So if we're using past observations to predict the future, why not conclude all emeralds are grew? If we do, we should expect future emeralds to be blue. The structure of reasoning is identical. So why does green feel natural and grew feel artificial? The paradox lies in this asymmetry. Both green and grew fit the observed data, yet only one is accepted as a valid basis for prediction. Goodman's question is piercing. What justifies one projection over another? If both match the past, what gives one precedence for the future? The intuitive answer is that green is a projectable predicate. It describes a natural property, something our minds and language evolved to grasp. Grew, by contrast, is gerrymandered. It builds in a temporal twist that feels contrived. But Goodman doesn't let us off the hook so easily. He points out that what counts as natural or simple might itself be a product of our conceptual biases. After all, in a different linguistic community, grew might be the norm, and green the contrivance. So, the paradox doesn't just destabilize induction, it questions the very language we use to describe reality. This has profound implications for scientific reasoning. Science is rooted in induction, observing patterns and projecting them forward. But Goodman's paradox reminds us that multiple mutually incompatible rules can fit the same data. Theories must do more than match observations. They must survive the test of projection. But what counts as a good projection? What counts as a natural property? These judgments are philosophical, not purely empirical. In machine learning, the paradox is especially relevant. A model can fit past data perfectly but fail catastrophically on new inputs. The grew problem is a metaphor for overfitting, when a system learns the noise, not the signal. It raises a timeless challenge. How do we distinguish between patterns that generalize and those that merely describe? The paradox also touches epistemology, the theory of knowledge. If observation alone cannot distinguish between green and grew, then knowledge must involve more than just data. It must include conceptual frameworks, historical habits, even aesthetic preferences. Goodman invites us to see induction not as a cold engine of logic, but as a practice shaped by culture and mind. So, what does Goodman's paradox teach us? First, data is not enough. Multiple theories can explain the same evidence. Prediction requires something deeper. Second, the language we use to describe reality shapes what we think is real. Even something as basic as color is a lens, not a mirror. Third, Induction is not a given. It's a philosophical commitment. Trusting that the future will resemble the past is not something logic demands. It's something we choose to believe. Goodman's paradox doesn't offer a clear solution. That's its power. It exposes a weakness in our most basic tool for understanding the world, our ability to generalize, and challenges us to justify not just what we believe, but why we believe it. So next time someone says, "This has always worked before," ask, "Worked how? In green terms, or grew?" Because in the end, the paradox reminds us that the future is not guaranteed by the past, and that even our most trusted truths may come with a hidden twist, waiting quietly in the next shade of blue.